Hello friends, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. I hope your day has been filled with blessings, no matter what time you're joining us or where you are in this beautiful world. Before we begin tonight's journey into the remarkable story of Gideon, I want to invite you to subscribe to Sacred Slumber so you never miss these powerful biblical narratives that can transform your heart and strengthen your faith. Now let's settle in as we explore one of the most extraordinary accounts of courage, faith, and divine intervention in all of Scripture. The sun hung low over the hills of Israel, casting long shadows across a land that had once flowed with milk and honey. But those days seemed like distant memories now. The once prosperous nation had fallen into chaos, its people scattered and hiding like frightened animals. For 7 long years, the Midianites had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. Picture, if you will, the terror that gripped every village and farmstead. Families would wake each morning not knowing if this would be the day the raiders would come. Fathers would venture out to check their crops, only to find them trampled and stolen. Children would be hushed to silence at the first sound of hoofbeats on the horizon. The very air seemed thick with fear and desperation. The Midianites, along with their allies, the Amalekites, and other eastern peoples, had turned the conquest of Israel into an annual ritual. Like a plague of locusts, they would arrive at harvest time, their camels beyond counting, stretching across the landscape as far as the eye could see. They would strip the land bare, taking not only the grain and livestock, but also crushing the spirits of God's chosen people. Farmers had abandoned their fields, choosing instead to hide in mountain caves and underground chambers. The marketplaces that once bustled with commerce now stood empty and silent. What should have been a time of celebration and thanksgiving for the harvest had become a season of dread and starvation. Israel's cities, once proud and strong, had crumbled into mere shadows of their former glory. The walls that should have protected the people lay in ruins, and the gates that once welcomed travellers now hung broken on their hinges. It was as if the very blessing of God had departed from the land, leaving behind only sorrow and defeat. In this atmosphere of despair, mothers would gather their children close and whisper the old stories of how God had delivered their ancestors from Egypt, how he had parted the Red Sea and given them victory over mighty enemies. But those stories seemed like fairy tales now, beautiful but impossible dreams from a time when God still cared about his people. The elders of Israel shook their heads in bewilderment. Where was the God of Abraham, Isaac and Jacob? Where was the mighty deliverer who had once fought for them? Had he forgotten his covenant? Had he abandoned them to their enemies forever? It was into this world of darkness and desperation that our story begins, in the small town of Ophrah, where a young man named Gideon was about to discover that God had not forgotten his people, after all. But Gideon, like so many others, had lost hope. He had watched his family's livelihood disappear year after year, and he had grown tired of empty promises and unanswered prayers. On this particular day, as storm clouds gathered on the horizon, both literally and figuratively, Gideon was engaged in the dangerous work of threshing wheat. But he wasn't doing it in the traditional threshing floor, where the grain could be properly separated from the chaff by the wind. Instead, he was hidden away in a wine press, a place where grapes were normally crushed to make wine. It was cramped, inefficient, and poorly ventilated, but it offered something more valuable than convenience. It offered concealment from enemy eyes. As Gideon worked in his makeshift hiding place, sweat dripping from his brow in the confined space, he embodied the broken spirit of his entire nation. Here was a man reduced to secret, fearful labour just to provide basic sustenance for his family. The very act of threshing wheat once a joyful community celebration, had become a furtive, isolated struggle for survival. Little did Gideon know that this moment of apparent defeat would become the launching pad for one of the most remarkable displays of God's power in human history. The God who seemed absent was actually watching, waiting, and preparing to use this unlikely hero in ways that would astound both friend and foe alike. The rhythm of Gideon's work was steady but tense. Each strike of his flail against the wheat stalks echoed softly in the confined space of the wine press. His eyes darted frequently toward the opening above, watching for any sign of danger. The precious grain he was salvaging represented not just food for today, but hope for tomorrow, assuming the Midianites didn't discover his hiding place. The silence of the afternoon was broken by an unexpected voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's heart nearly stopped. He spun around, flail raised defensively, expecting to see a Midianite scout who had somehow discovered his secret location. Instead, he found himself face to face with a figure unlike any he had ever encountered. The stranger sat calmly beneath the great oak tree that overlooked the wine press, his presence somehow both commanding and peaceful. The greeting struck Gideon as almost mockingly ironic. Mighty warrior, him, the man who was reduced to threshing wheat in secret, constantly looking over his shoulder in fear, and the Lord is with you? If that were true, then why was Israel suffering under such devastating oppression? "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon replied, his voice heavy with skepticism and pain. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt?' But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian." The words poured out of Gideon like water from a broken dam. Years of frustration, disappointment, and unanswered questions came tumbling forth. He had grown up hearing the magnificent stories of God's mighty deeds, of pillars of fire and cloud, of armies defeated and nations subdued. But where was that God now? Where were those miracles when his people needed them most? The stranger listened patiently to Gideon's outburst, showing no offence at the young man's boldness or apparent lack of faith. There was something in his eyes that spoke of ancient wisdom and unlimited compassion. When Gideon finished speaking, the visitor's response was both simple and earth-shattering. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" The audacity of the command took Gideon's breath away. Save Israel? Him? The implications were staggering. This wasn't a request for him to join an army or support a cause. This was a divine commission to personally lead the deliverance of an entire nation from a seemingly impossible situation. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon stammered, his mind reeling, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." Gideon's response revealed the depth of his feelings of inadequacy. In a culture where tribal strength and family position determined social standing and influence, he saw himself as doubly disqualified. His clan held no political power, commanded no great armies, and possessed no significant wealth. Within that already weak clan, he was the youngest, the most inexperienced, the least likely to be chosen for any position of leadership. But the stranger's next words would echo through the ages as one of the most profound promises ever given to a human being. "I will be with you, and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise was comprehensive and absolute. Not some of the Midianites, not most of them, but all of them. The victory would be complete and decisive, but more importantly, it would not depend on Gideon's strength, wisdom, or experience. It would depend entirely on the presence and power of God himself. Still struggling to believe what he was hearing, Gideon made a request that would reveal both his desire for faith and his need for certainty. If now I have found favour in your eyes, give me a sign that it is really you talking to me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you. The stranger agreed to wait, and Gideon hurried to his house to prepare an offering. His heart raced as he worked, his hands trembling slightly as he prepared a young goat and made bread from an ephah of flour. This was not a small offering by the standards of his time, especially for a family struggling under the oppression of constant raids. Yet something within him compelled him to give generously, to honour this mysterious visitor properly. When Gideon returned with the prepared food, the stranger instructed him to place the meat and unleavened bread on a rock and pour out the broth. Gideon obeyed, though he couldn't understand the purpose of these strange instructions. What happened next would leave no doubt about the supernatural nature of his visitor. The stranger touched the meat and bread with the tip of the staff he carried, and immediately fire flared from the rock, consuming the entire offering in an instant. The flames burned with an intensity and heat that no ordinary fire could match, leaving nothing behind but the memory of their brilliance. In that same moment, the stranger vanished from sight, disappearing as suddenly and mysteriously as he had appeared. Terror gripped Gideon's heart as the full realization of what had just occurred crashed over him like a mighty wave. This had been no ordinary man, no mere messenger or prophet. This had been the angel of the Lord, a manifestation of God himself. In that moment of understanding, Gideon was overwhelmed not with joy, but with mortal fear. "Alas, sovereign Lord," he cried out in anguish, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." In the ancient world, it was believed that no human could see God and live. The very encounter that should have filled him with confidence instead filled him with terror. Had his boldness in questioning and testing the Lord sealed his doom? Would he die for having stood in the presence of the Almighty? But even in his moment of greatest fear, God's grace reached out to comfort him. The voice of the Lord came to him again, gentle and reassuring. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." With his own hands, Gideon built an altar on that spot and called it, "The Lord is Peace." The place where he had threshed wheat in fear and desperation had become holy ground, the site of a divine encounter that would change not only his life, but the destiny of an entire nation. As night fell over Ophrah, Gideon stood beside his new altar, his mind swirling with the magnitude of what had occurred. The God of his ancestors had not abandoned Israel after all. He had been working, planning, preparing for this very moment, and somehow, incredibly, he had chosen Gideon to be his instrument of deliverance. Yet even as faith began to bloom in his heart, doubt lingered like shadows at the edges of his mind. The task before him seemed impossible, the odds insurmountable. How could he, one man from the weakest clan in Manasseh, possibly hope to defeat the countless multitudes of Midian and their allies? It was a question that would lead him to make one of the most famous requests for divine confirmation in all of Scripture. The days following Gideon's encounter with the angel of the Lord were filled with a mixture of excitement and anxiety. The divine commissioning had been clear and unmistakable, yet the human heart, prone to doubt and fear, struggled to fully embrace what seemed impossible. Gideon found himself caught between the supernatural certainty of his calling and the natural uncertainties of his circumstances. As he went about his daily tasks, Gideon's mind constantly returned to that moment when fire had consumed his offering and the angel had vanished from sight. Had it really happened? In the bright light of day, with the familiar sounds and sights of ordinary life surrounding him, the encounter almost seemed like a dream. Yet the altar he had built stood as a permanent reminder, its stones bearing witness to the reality of what had occurred. Word began to spread quietly through the region about Gideon's calling. Some believed and were filled with hope for the first time in years. Others were sceptical, wondering how this young man could possibly succeed where so many others had failed. Still others were fearful, worried that any attempt at resistance would only bring more severe retaliation from their oppressors. The weight of responsibility pressed heavily on Gideon's shoulders. He was being asked not just to risk his own life, but potentially to lead others to their deaths. What if he had misunderstood? What if his faith had somehow led him astray? The consequences of a mistake would be catastrophic, not just for him, but for all who would follow him. It was in this state of mind that Gideon made his famous request for divine confirmation. The fleece test, as it would come to be known, represented not a lack of faith, but rather a deep desire for certainty in the face of overwhelming responsibility. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," Gideon prayed earnestly, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece, and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." The request was specific and measurable. In the normal course of nature, dew would form on all surfaces exposed to the night air. If God could reverse this natural process, causing moisture to collect only on the fleece, while leaving the surrounding ground completely dry, it would serve as an unmistakable sign of divine intervention. Gideon placed the fleece carefully on the threshing floor as evening approached. All through the night he must have awakened periodically, wondering what he would find in the morning. As dawn broke, he hurried to the spot where he had placed his test. What he discovered filled him with wonder and awe. The fleece was thoroughly saturated with dew, so much so that when he wrung it out, he was able to fill an entire bowl with water. Yet all around it, the ground was completely dry, as if an invisible barrier had prevented any moisture from settling anywhere but on the wool. The sign was clear and unmistakable, yet Gideon's human nature craved even greater certainty. The magnitude of what he was being called to do seemed to justify asking for additional confirmation. With remarkable humility and boldness he approached God with yet another request. "Do not be angry with me," Gideon prayed, acknowledging that his repeated testing might seem to indicate a lack of trust. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." This second test was even more remarkable than the first. It would be one thing for God to cause dew to collect on a single object, while keeping the surrounding area dry, but it would be quite another to keep one small piece of wool completely dry while saturating everything around it. This second sign would demonstrate not just God's power over nature, but his precise control over the smallest details. Again, Gideon placed the fleece on the threshing floor and waited through the night. When morning came, he found exactly what he had requested. The fleece was bone dry without a trace of moisture, while the ground all around it sparkled with heavy dew. The grass, the stones, the nearby trees, everything was wet with the night's moisture, except for that one small piece of wool. God had patiently granted both requests, demonstrating not anger at Gideon's need for reassurance, but understanding and compassion for human weakness. The fleece tests revealed important truths about the nature of faith and the character of God. Faith is not the absence of questions or doubts. Rather, it is the willingness to act in obedience despite those questions and doubts. Moreover, God's response to Gideon's requests showed his patience with those who seek him earnestly. He did not rebuke Gideon for his need for confirmation, nor did he withdraw his calling because of the young man's hesitation. Instead, he graciously provided the assurance that Gideon needed to step forward in faith. The fleece tests also demonstrated the balance between seeking divine guidance and taking action. There comes a point when further testing can become an excuse for inaction, when the desire for certainty becomes a barrier to obedience. Gideon wisely limited his requests to 2 clear signs, then proceeded to act on what he'd received. As news of these miraculous signs spread throughout the tribes of Israel, hope began to stir in hearts that had been dormant for years. Perhaps God had not forgotten them after all. Perhaps deliverance was indeed coming through this unlikely young man from Ophrah. But before Gideon could lead Israel into battle against their oppressors, he would need to assemble an army. The call went out throughout the territories of Manasseh, Asher, Zebulun, and Naphtali. Men who had been hiding in caves and mountain strongholds began to emerge, drawn by the promise of freedom and the reports of God's miraculous confirmations. The response was overwhelming. 32,000 men answered the call, a substantial army by any measure. These were not professional soldiers, but farmers and craftsmen, fathers and sons, united by their hatred of oppression and their desperate hope for liberation. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find, swords that had been hidden from enemy raids, spears hastily fashioned from farming tools, bows that had been used for hunting game in the wilderness. As Gideon looked out over this vast assembly of volunteers, he might have felt a surge of confidence. Surely with 32,000 men, even amateur fighters, he could mount a credible challenge to the Midianite forces. The odds were still daunting, given that the enemy could field armies many times larger, but at least now they had a fighting chance. Yet God had other plans. The fleece tests had been preparation not just for Gideon's faith, but for an even greater demonstration of divine power. The true test was not whether Gideon could trust God with impossible signs, but whether he could trust God with an impossible strategy. What happened next would shock both Gideon and his army, challenging every human assumption about warfare and victory. God was about to demonstrate that his ways are not our ways, and that his power is made perfect, not in human strength, but in human weakness. The morning sun cast long shadows across the camp as 32,000 men prepared for what they believed would be their march to war. Weapons were sharpened, provisions were packed, and final prayers were offered. The air buzzed with nervous energy as farmers turned warriors contemplated the battle that lay ahead. Gideon moved among his troops, offering words of encouragement and trying to project the confidence that a leader must display. Yet privately, he was still awed by the magnitude of what was happening. Just weeks earlier, he had been hiding in a wine press, and now he stood at the head of the largest volunteer army Israel had assembled in generations. But as the army prepared to march toward the enemy encampment, God spoke to Gideon with words that must have sent shockwaves through his entire being. "You have too many men. I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. Our own strength has saved us." Too many men? The statement seemed to defy all military logic. The Midianites and their allies numbered in the hundreds of thousands. Their camels alone described as being like locusts for multitude. How could 32,000 possibly be considered too many? Yet God's reasoning revealed a profound truth about the nature of divine deliverance. If Israel won the coming battle through conventional military means, they would inevitably credit their victory to their own strength, strategy, and courage. The victory needed to be so obviously supernatural that no one could mistake its source. God's glory was at stake, and that glory could not be shared with human pride. Following God's instructions, Gideon stood before his assembled army and made an announcement that must have stunned many of the volunteers. Anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead. The offer was based on an ancient law found in Deuteronomy, which recognised that fearful soldiers could spread panic through the ranks and actually weaken an army's effectiveness. But in this case, the dismissal served a different purpose entirely. God was beginning the process of reducing the army to a size that would make his intervention unmistakable. The response to Gideon's announcement was immediate and devastating. 22,000 men took advantage of the opportunity to withdraw from what many probably saw as a suicide mission anyway. These were not cowards in the traditional sense. They were ordinary people facing an extraordinary situation, and they chose the safety of their families over the uncertainties of battle. As Gideon watched more than 2/3 of his army walk away, his heart must have sunk. 10,000 men remained, still a respectable force, but far fewer than what seemed necessary for the task ahead. Surely now they could proceed with God's blessing. But God was not finished with his reductions. "There are still too many men," came the divine word. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there. If I say, 'This one shall go with you,' he shall go. But if I say, 'This one shall not go with you,' he shall not go." The instruction was puzzling and specific. Gideon was to observe how the men drank water and select his final army based on their drinking method. Of all the criteria that might be used to choose warriors, how they consumed water seemed among the least relevant to military prowess. At the water's edge, the 10,000 men revealed their character through their approach to drinking. The vast majority knelt down and put their faces directly to the water, drinking deeply and focusing entirely on satisfying their thirst. But a small group, only 300 men, demonstrated a different approach. They brought water to their mouths with their hands, lapping it like dogs while maintaining their vigilance and readiness. God's instruction was clear. "With the 300 men that lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands. Let all the others go home." The reduction was complete and shocking. From 32,000 to 300 represented a decrease of more than 99%. What had begun as a substantial army was now reduced to little more than a large company. The odds, already daunting, had become mathematically absurd. Yet the selection criteria revealed profound spiritual truths. The 300 men who were chosen had demonstrated alertness, self-discipline, and readiness, even in a moment of personal need. While drinking, they had maintained their awareness of their surroundings, prepared for action at a moment's notice. These qualities, while admirable in soldiers, were really symbols of spiritual preparedness and faithfulness. As the dismissed soldiers departed, taking most of the weapons and supplies with them, Gideon was left with 300 men who looked more like a ceremonial guard than a fighting force. The enemy they faced was described in terms that emphasized their overwhelming numbers. All the Midianites, the Amalekites, and the other eastern peoples had settled in the valley, thick as locusts. Their camels could no more be counted than the sand on the seashore. The disparity was so extreme that it moved beyond the realm of military strategy into the realm of the miraculous. No human commander would voluntarily reduce his forces to such a level when facing such overwhelming odds. Yet this was precisely God's point. The victory that was coming would be so clearly divine in origin that no one could attribute it to human planning or prowess. For Gideon, this final reduction must have been the ultimate test of faith. Everything in his military thinking, everything in his natural instincts, everything in conventional wisdom screamed against such a strategy. Yet his experiences with the fleece had prepared him for this moment. He had learned to trust God's ways even when they contradicted human logic. The 300 men who remained showed remarkable faith as well. They could see the enemy forces spread across the valley below them. They knew the odds better than anyone, yet they chose to stay, to trust in the God who had called them through his servant Gideon. As night fell over the Israelite camp, the 300 men prepared for what would be the most unconventional battle in military history. They had no idea that they were about to participate in a victory that would be remembered and celebrated for thousands of years. A victory that would demonstrate God's power to use the weak to confound the mighty. The stage was set for a night that would change everything. The Midianites slept in their countless tents, confident in their overwhelming superiority. The 300 Israelites made their final preparations, trusting in a God who specialized in impossible victories. The hours before dawn are often the darkest, both literally and figuratively. As Gideon and his 300 men crouched in the hills overlooking the vast enemy encampment, the weight of their impossible mission pressed down upon them like a physical burden. The valley below was filled with the tents of their enemies, stretching as far as the eye could see in the starlight, a sea of canvas that housed an army larger than any they had ever faced. Despite the miraculous signs he had witnessed and the divine assurances he had received, Gideon still struggled with doubt. God, in his infinite understanding of human nature, provided one more confirmation before the battle commenced. "Get up, go down against the camp," the Lord instructed, "because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, you will be encouraged to attack the camp." The offer revealed God's compassionate understanding of Gideon's anxiety. Rather than rebuking him for his continued fears, the Lord provided an opportunity for reassurance. Taking his servant Purah with him, Gideon crept down toward the perimeter of the enemy camp under cover of darkness. The Midianite camp was massive beyond imagination. Thousands upon thousands of tents housed warriors from multiple nations united in their conquest of Israel. The sounds of the sleeping army filled the night air, snoring soldiers, restless camels, the occasional challenge of sentries. The very scale of the enemy forces should have been overwhelming to any reasonable observer. As Gideon and Purah approached the outer edge of the camp, they overheard a conversation between two Midianite soldiers. One was telling his companion about a disturbing dream he had experienced. "I had a dream. A round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." The interpretation offered by his fellow soldier was even more remarkable. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." The irony was profound. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, God was providing confirmation through the mouths of Israel's oppressors themselves. The barley bread in the dream was significant. Barley was considered the food of the poor, inferior to wheat. Yet in the dream, this humble loaf had the power to destroy the entire enemy position. The symbolism was clear. God would use the humble and despised to bring down the mighty and proud. That Gideon's name was already known to the enemy indicated that word of the gathering Israelite resistance had reached their ears. Rather than being encouraged by their overwhelming numerical superiority, some among the Midianites were apparently experiencing anxiety about this upstart Hebrew leader. God was already working in the hearts and minds of the enemy, preparing them for defeat. Gideon and Purah retreated to their own lines, hearts pounding with excitement and renewed confidence. The doubt that had plagued Gideon was finally dispelled by this remarkable confirmation. When they reached the Israelite position, Gideon called his men together for final instructions. "Get up," he announced with newfound authority and confidence. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." What followed was perhaps the most unusual battle plan in military history. Instead of swords and spears, Gideon distributed trumpets, empty clay jars, and torches to each of his 300 men. The weapons of conventional warfare were set aside in favour of items that seemed more suited to a religious ceremony than a military campaign. Gideon divided his small force into 3 companies of 100 men each. The strategy was simple, yet audacious. They would surround the enemy camp and, at Gideon's signal, create as much noise and confusion as possible while giving the appearance of a much larger force. "Watch me," Gideon instructed his men. "Follow my lead. When I get to the edge of the camp, do exactly as I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then from all around the camp blow yours and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan required perfect timing and coordination. Each man would conceal his torch inside a clay jar, maintaining complete darkness and silence until the moment of attack. Then at Gideon's signal, they would simultaneously break their jars, revealing blazing torches, blow their trumpets with all their might, and shout their battle cry. The psychological impact was designed to be devastating. The enemy would suddenly find themselves surrounded by lights and noise, creating the impression of a massive attacking force. In the confusion of a night assault, with limited visibility and the disorientation of being awakened from sleep, even experienced soldiers could panic and lose their sense of direction. As the 3 companies moved into position around the vast perimeter of the enemy camp, each man must have felt the weight of the moment. They were not professional soldiers, but ordinary citizens who had answered the call to fight for their freedom. Now they found themselves in the most critical moment of their lives, armed with the most unconventional weapons imaginable, trusting in a God who had promised victory through seemingly impossible means. The middle watch around midnight was traditionally the time when sentries were changed, and vigilance was often at its lowest point. It was at this precise moment that Gideon and his 100 men reached their assigned position on the edge of the camp. Across the valley, 200 other men waited in similar positions, every eye fixed on their leader for the signal that would begin the battle. Gideon raised his torch-filled jar high above his head, then brought it down sharply, smashing it against a rock. The clay shattered with a sound that seemed to echo across the silent valley, and immediately his torch blazed forth in the darkness. At the same instant, he lifted his trumpet to his lips and blew a long, piercing blast. "For the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The signal rippled around the camp as 300 jars smashed simultaneously. 300 torches burst into flame, and 300 trumpet hags sounded their defiant call. The battle cry of "For the Lord and for Gideon" echoed from every direction, creating the impression that the Midianite camp was completely surrounded by a massive army. The effect was instantaneous and devastating. Thousands of sleeping soldiers were jolted awake to find their camp surrounded by blazing lights and deafening noise. In the confusion and darkness, panic spread like wildfire through the ranks. Soldiers stumbled from their tents, grabbing whatever weapons they could find, unable to determine the size or direction of the attacking force. In their panic and confusion, the Midianites and their allies began attacking each other. Unable to distinguish friend from foe in the darkness, and hearing battle cries in their own languages from every direction, they assumed they had been betrayed by their allies. The coalition that had seemed so formidable began to tear itself apart. The 300 Israelites maintained their positions around the perimeter, continuing to blow their trumpets and hold their torches high, creating the illusion of a massive army that had the enemy completely surrounded. They watched in amazement as God fulfilled his promise in the most spectacular fashion imaginable. The panic spread throughout the entire camp like a plague. What had begun as confusion quickly escalated into a full-scale rout as the enemy forces fled in every direction, abandoning their weapons, supplies, and even their camels in their desperate attempt to escape what they perceived as certain destruction. The victory was complete and overwhelming, achieved not through superior numbers or military might, but through divine intervention, working through the obedience of 300 faithful men. The God who had called Gideon from his hiding place in the winepress had once again demonstrated that his power is made perfect in human weakness. As dawn broke over the valley, an astonishing sight greeted the 300 Israelites. Where the night before had stood the mighty encampment of Israel's oppressors, now lay only scattered debris and abandoned supplies. Tents stood empty, their guy ropes cut by fleeing soldiers. Weapons lay discarded where they had fallen from panicked hands. The camels that had been described as innumerable as locusts wandered aimlessly, their owners having fled into the wilderness. The ground itself told the story of the night's chaos. Bloodstains marked the spots where confused allies had struck down one another in the darkness. Personal belongings were strewn across the landscape as the fleeing army had abandoned everything that might slow their escape. The scene looked less like the aftermath of a battle and more like the remnants of a catastrophic natural disaster. Gideon and his men moved through the abandoned camp in wonder, scarcely believing what their eyes were witnessing. The victory was so complete, so overwhelming, that it seemed almost too good to be true. Yet the evidence was undeniable. The army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years had been routed by 300 men armed with trumpets and torches. But God's deliverance was not yet complete. Even as the 300 marvelled at what had occurred in the valley, word of the miraculous victory was spreading throughout the hill country of Israel. Men who had dismissed Gideon's call to arms, who had remained hidden in their caves and strongholds, now emerged with renewed courage and determination. The tribes of Naphtali, Asher and Manasseh rallied to pursue the fleeing Midianites. What had begun with 300 faithful men now swelled into a national movement of liberation. The psychological impact of the victory was as important as the military result. The myth of Midianite invincibility had been shattered in a single night, and the spirit of resistance that had been dormant for so long now burst forth like a river breaking through a dam. Gideon sent messengers throughout the hill country of Ephraim with urgent instructions. Come down against the Midianites and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah. This strategic move would cut off the enemy's escape routes and ensure that the victory would be complete. The Ephraimites responded with enthusiasm, capturing the fords of the Jordan and trapping many of the fleeing Midianites. In the pursuit that followed, they captured 2 of the Midianite leaders, Oreb and Zeb, whose names meant raven and wolf. These princes, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for years, were now defeated and killed at the places that would forever bear their names: the rock of Oreb and the winepress of Zeb. The pursuit continued beyond the Jordan as Gideon and his original 300, though exhausted, pressed on to capture the remaining Midianite kings, Zaba and Zalmunna. The victory was total and decisive. An empire that had dominated the region for 7 years was completely destroyed in a matter of days. The land of Israel enjoyed peace for 40 years during Gideon's lifetime. The oppression that had driven families into hiding was replaced by prosperity and security. fields that had been abandoned were cultivated again. Markets that had stood empty bustled with commerce. Children who had grown up knowing only fear could now play freely in their villages. But perhaps the greatest victory was not military but spiritual. Israel had rediscovered that their God was still the same mighty deliverer who had brought their ancestors out of Egypt. The impossible victory served as a permanent reminder that with God all things are possible. The story of Gideon and the 300 speaks across the centuries, with timeless truths that challenge and encourage us today. First, we see that God uses the unlikely. Gideon was not a seasoned warrior or a natural leader. He was a fearful farmer, hiding from his enemies. Yet God saw potential that others missed. This reminds us that God's calling is not based on our qualifications, but on his purposes. Second, the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300 demonstrates that faith matters more than numbers. In a world obsessed with statistics and metrics, God's economy operates differently. He delights in using small faithful remnants to accomplish great things, ensuring that his power, not human strength, receives the glory. Third, Gideon's requests for signs teach us about the balance between faith and doubt. God was patient with Gideon's need for confirmation, showing us that honest questions and requests for reassurance are not signs of weak faith but of a heart that desires to walk in God's will. Finally, the story shows us that obedience in the face of fear is the essence of courage. Gideon was afraid, his army was outnumbered, and the strategy seemed foolish. Yet they obeyed, and God honoured their faithfulness with victory. When we feel unqualified for the tasks before us, when the odds seem insurmountable, when we need reassurance before taking steps of faith, the story of Gideon reminds us that our God specialises in impossible victories. He is still calling ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, still using the weak to confound the mighty, still turning fearful hearts into faithful warriors. The God who met Gideon at the winepress is the same God who meets us in our hiding places today, calling us to step out in faith and watch him work miracles through surrendered lives. Just as the 300 trumpets and torches became instruments of divine victory, our simple obedience can become the means through which God accomplishes his purposes in our generation. May we have the courage to answer when he calls, the faith to trust when he leads, and the persistence to follow when he sends us into battles that seem impossible to win. For with God, the 300 can defeat the multitudes, and faith can move mountains that seem immovable. The story of Gideon reminds us that our greatest victories come not when we feel strong and capable, but when we acknowledge our weakness and depend completely on God's strength. In those moments of surrender, we discover that we serve a God who delights in doing the impossible through the most unlikely people. And so the story ends where it began, with an invitation to faith, a call to courage, and a promise that the God who delivered Israel through Gideon and the 300 is still delivering his people today, one impossible victory at a time.
Hello dear listener and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know how your day has been. Whether it was filled with joy or challenges, you're exactly where you need to be right now. What time is it where you are in the world? Are you settling down for the evening, or perhaps finding a quiet moment in the middle of your day? Wherever you are listening from, know that you are part of our global community of souls, seeking peace and spiritual connection. If this is your first time joining us, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. We're here to bring you stories that nourish the spirit and calm the mind. Tonight, we journey to ancient Judah, to a time when God called a young man named Jeremiah to carry a message of both warning and hope. This is a story about divine calling, about being reshaped by loving hands, and about finding purpose even in the midst of struggle. So settle in, take a deep breath, and let us begin. In the 13th year of King Josiah's reign over the kingdom of Judah, when the morning mist still clung to the hills of Anathoth, a young man named Jeremiah sat beneath the shade of an ancient olive tree. The leaves whispered secrets in the gentle breeze, and somewhere in that whisper something stirred within his heart. Something he couldn't yet name, but could feel as surely as the warm earth beneath his feet. Jeremiah was not like the other young men of his village. While they spoke boldly of their plans and dreams, he preferred the quiet company of his thoughts. While they gathered in the marketplace to debate and jest, he found himself drawn to solitary places where he could listen to the deeper rhythms of life. His father, Hilkiah, was a priest, and perhaps that was why Jeremiah felt such a natural pull toward the sacred, toward the spaces where heaven seemed to touch earth. On this particular morning, as the sun climbed higher and cast dancing shadows through the olive branches, Jeremiah felt that familiar stirring grow stronger. It was as if someone were calling his name from a great distance, though he heard no voice with his ears. The sensation was both thrilling and terrifying, like standing at the edge of a vast ocean, knowing you were meant to step in but uncertain of your ability to swim. Then, as clearly as if someone had spoken directly into his ear, came the words that would change everything. Before I formed you in the womb, I knew you. Before you were born, I set you apart. I appointed you as a prophet to the nations. Jeremiah's heart raced. He looked around, half expecting to see someone standing nearby, but he was alone with only the olive tree and the endless blue sky as witnesses. The voice came again, gentle yet unmistakable. Jeremiah, I have called you to be my messenger. The young man's immediate response was one of panic. Sovereign Lord, he whispered, his voice barely audible even to himself. I don't know how to speak. I am too young. Who would listen to me? I am nobody special, just a priest's son from a small village. Surely you have made a mistake. But the presence that surrounded him was filled with such love and certainty that his fears began to quiet. Do not say you are too young, came the gentle correction. You must go to everyone I send you to and say whatever I command you. Do not be afraid of them, for I am with you and will rescue you. In that moment, Jeremiah felt something touch his lips. Not a physical touch, but something deeper, more real than anything he had ever experienced. I have put my words in your mouth, the voice continued. See, today I appoint you over nations and kingdoms to uproot and tear down, to destroy and overthrow, to build and to plant. As the presence gradually faded, leaving only the normal sounds of morning, birds singing, leaves rustling, the distant lowing of cattle, Jeremiah remained sitting beneath the olive tree, stunned by what had just occurred. His life had been ordinary just moments before, and now he was being called to something extraordinary. The weight of it should have crushed him, but instead he felt a strange peace settling over his spirit. He didn't yet understand what lay ahead, couldn't foresee the years of rejection and persecution that awaited him, or the deep wells of sorrow he would have to draw from. He only knew that the God of his fathers had spoken to him, had chosen him for a purpose that was both terrible and wonderful. And though he trembled at the thought of it, something deep within him whispered back, Yes, Lord, I will go. Months passed after Jeremiah's calling, and he found himself struggling with the enormity of his task. The messages that came to him were not easy ones. Words of warning about the spiritual condition of Judah, prophecies of coming judgment if the people didn't turn back to their God. How could he, a young man with no credentials or authority, stand before the elders and priests and kings with such heavy words? One morning, as Jeremiah prayed in the quiet of his chamber, seeking guidance for this impossible mission, he heard the familiar voice of the Lord speaking to him once again. Go down to the potter's house, and there I will give you my message. Jeremiah had passed by the potter's house countless times in his life, but had never paid it much attention. It was a humble building on the outskirts of the village, marked by the constant sound of the spinning wheel and the earthy smell of wet clay. As he approached that day, however, he felt a sense of anticipation, as if he were about to witness something profound. The potter was an elderly man named Malachi, whose hands bore the calluses and clay stains of decades spent at his craft. His hair was white as wool, and his eyes held the patient wisdom of someone who had spent his life creating beauty from formless earth. When Jeremiah arrived, Malachi looked up from his wheel and smiled, as if he'd been expecting him. "Shalom, young prophet," Malachi said, his voice warm with genuine kindness. "Please sit and watch. I have work to do." Jeremiah settled himself on a wooden stool in the corner of the workshop, fascinated despite himself. He had never really watched a potter at work before, had never paid attention to the intricate process of creation that happened in this simple space. The wheel began to turn, and Malachi placed a lump of clay in the centre, his hands moving with practiced precision. At first the clay seemed to resist, wobbling and threatening to collapse, but Malachi's hands were steady and sure, applying just the right amount of pressure, guiding the clay upward into the beginning of what would become a vessel. Jeremiah watched in wonder as the formless lump slowly took shape, a wide base, curving sides, the promise of something beautiful and functional. But then something went wrong. Perhaps there was a stone in the clay, or a dry patch that wouldn't bend. The emerging vessel began to collapse, its sides caving in despite the potter's careful ministrations. Jeremiah expected to see frustration on Malachi's face, perhaps anger at the ruined work. Instead, the old man simply smiled and pressed the clay back into a lump, ready to begin again. "The clay has its own nature," Malachi explained, his hands already starting to reshape the material. "Sometimes it has hard spots, or air bubbles, or impurities that make it difficult to work with. But clay is forgiving. It can always be reformed, reshaped, made into something new." As Jeremiah watched, the potter began again, this time working the clay more thoroughly, removing the impurities that had caused the first attempt to fail. Slowly, patiently, lovingly, a new vessel began to emerge, different from the first but no less beautiful. In fact, this second creation seemed to have a character all its own, shaped by the very challenges that had destroyed its predecessor. It was then that Jeremiah heard the voice of the Lord speaking to him, as clear as if someone were standing beside him. "Can I not do with you, Israel, as this potter does? Like clay in the hand of the potter, so are you in my hand." The words hit Jeremiah like a revelation. He understood now why he had been sent to this place, why he needed to witness this simple yet profound act of creation. The people of Judah were like clay in God's hands, sometimes stubborn, sometimes marred by the impurities of sin and rebellion. But God was not a harsh taskmaster who would discard them when they failed to take shape properly. He was like Malachi, patient and loving, willing to reshape them again and again until they became the vessels he had always intended them to be. "The message I want you to carry," the Lord continued, "is not just one of judgment, but of hope. Yes, I must sometimes tear down what is corrupt and broken, but I tear down in order to build up again, in order to create something better and more beautiful than before." Jeremiah felt tears welling up in his eyes as he watched the potter's hands continue their gentle work. Here was a picture of God's character that he had never fully grasped before, not the angry judge he had sometimes imagined, but the patient artist who sees potential in every lump of clay, who never gives up on his creation, who can bring beauty from the most unlikely materials. "Thank you," he whispered to Malachi as he prepared to leave. The old potter looked up from his work and smiled. "The clay thanks the potter by yielding to his hands," Malachi replied. "Perhaps that is all any of us can do, yield to the hands that know how to shape us into something beautiful." As Jeremiah walked home through the narrow streets of his village, he felt a new understanding of his calling beginning to take root in his heart. He was not just a bearer of bad news, but a messenger of hope. The God who had called him was not a destroyer but a creator, not a tyrant but a loving craftsman who would never abandon his work. The words came to him then, the message he would carry to the people of Judah. If at any time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be uprooted, torn down and destroyed, and if that nation I warned repents of its evil, then I will relent and not inflict on it the disaster I had planned. And if at another time I announce that a nation or kingdom is to be built up and planted, and if it does evil in my sight and does not obey me, then I will reconsider the good I had intended to do for it. It was a message of both warning and promise, of judgment and mercy intertwined. Like the potter's hands, God's discipline was always aimed at restoration, always working toward the creation of something more beautiful than before. Armed with this new understanding, Jeremiah began his prophetic ministry in earnest. But if he had hoped that his message of God's love and patience would be readily received, he was quickly disillusioned. The people of Judah, from the poorest peasant to the most powerful priest, seemed determined to resist the very hands that were trying to reshape them. His first major public appearance came during the reign of King Jehoiakim, Josiah's son, who had turned away from his father's reforms and allowed idolatry to flourish once again throughout the land. Jeremiah stood in the temple courts, his voice carrying across the stone courtyard as he delivered the message God had given him. "This is what the Lord says," he proclaimed, his young voice growing stronger with each word. "Reform your ways and your actions, and I will let you live in this place. Do not trust in deceptive words and say, 'This is the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord, the temple of the Lord.' If you really change your ways and your actions and deal with each other justly, if you do not oppress the foreigner, the fatherless or the widow, and do not shed innocent blood in this place, and if you do not follow other gods to your own harm, then I will let you live in this place in the land I gave your ancestors for ever and ever." The reaction was immediate and hostile. The priests, who had grown comfortable with their compromises and political alliances, saw Jeremiah's words as a direct threat to their authority. The wealthy merchants and nobles who had prospered by exploiting the poor and forming partnerships with pagan nations heard his call for justice as an attack on their way of life. "Who does this young man think he is?" they muttered among themselves. "He speaks of judgment and destruction like some kind of doomsday prophet. Where is his authority? Where are his credentials?" But Jeremiah continued, his heart breaking even as he spoke the words God had given him. He could see the spiritual adultery that had infected his beloved nation, the way they had turned from the God who had delivered them from Egypt and given them this promised land. They had made alliances with foreign powers, adopted their gods, and forgotten the covenant that had made them a people set apart. "My people have committed 2 sins," he declared, his voice now thick with emotion. "They have forsaken me, the spring of living water, and have dug their own cisterns, broken cisterns that cannot hold water." The imagery was powerful and heartbreaking. Jeremiah could see it so clearly. A nation that had access to the purest, most life-giving water imaginable, yet had chosen instead to dig broken wells that left them thirsty and desperate. They had exchanged their glory for worthless idols, their security for political alliances that would ultimately fail them. As the weeks and months passed, Jeremiah's message remained consistent, but the opposition grew fiercer. He was mocked in the streets, his words dismissed as the ravings of a madman. Children threw stones at him, and adults crossed to the other side of the road to avoid his presence. The loneliness was crushing, but what hurt most was seeing the people he loved rushing toward destruction, their ears closed to the voice of the one who wanted to save them. One particularly dark day, after being physically threatened by a group of priests who wanted to silence him permanently, Jeremiah found himself wondering if he had misunderstood his calling. Perhaps God hadn't really spoken to him at all. Perhaps he was just a deluded young man with an overactive imagination and a tendency toward melancholy. But then he remembered the potter's house, the gentle hands shaping and reshaping the clay, and he understood something profound about the nature of love. True love doesn't just tell people what they want to hear, it tells them what they need to hear, even when that truth is painful. The potter sometimes had to apply pressure to the clay, had to work out the impurities and air bubbles, And this process wasn't always comfortable for the clay, but it was necessary for the clay to become what it was meant to be. "I am not their enemy," Jeremiah whispered to himself as he walked through the quiet streets late one evening. "I am their friend. I am speaking these hard words because I love them, because God loves them, because we can't bear to see them destroy themselves." The revelation gave him strength to continue, even as the opposition intensified. He began to write down his prophecies, creating a record of God's words that could be preserved even if his voice was silenced. He wrote of the coming judgment, but also of the hope that lay beyond it, the promise of a new covenant, a time when God would write his law on their hearts rather than on tablets of stone. "The days are coming," he wrote, his hand moving quickly across the parchment, "when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people." Even in the midst of his loneliness and rejection, Jeremiah held on to this vision of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The process might be painful, but the end result would be worth it all. There came a time when the weight of his calling became almost too much for Jeremiah to bear. The constant rejection, the threats, the loneliness of being God's messenger to a people who didn't want to hear from God. It all pressed down on him like a physical burden. He had been faithful to his calling for years now, and what did he have to show for it? A nation that seemed more rebellious than ever, leaders who actively opposed him, and a heart that felt like it might break from the strain. The breaking point came when Pashur, the priest who was chief officer in the temple, had Jeremiah beaten and put in stocks overnight for prophesying that Jerusalem would be destroyed. The humiliation was complete, displayed like a common criminal in front of the very people he was trying to save. When he was released the next morning, bruised and aching, Jeremiah's first instinct was to flee. He made his way to his favourite spot of solitude, a small grove of trees outside the city where he often went to pray. There, surrounded by the peaceful sounds of nature, he poured out his heart to God in words that were both complaint and lament. "You deceived me, Lord, and I was deceived," he cried out, his voice raw with emotion. "You overpowered me and prevailed. I am ridiculed all day long. Everyone mocks me. Whenever I speak, I cry out proclaiming violence and destruction. So the word of the Lord has brought me insult and reproach all day long." The words felt almost blasphemous as they left his lips, but they were honest words, torn from the depths of his soul. He had given everything to this calling: his youth, his dreams of a normal life, his relationships with family and friends. And for what? To be treated as a pariah, a madman, a troublemaker. In that moment of deepest despair, Jeremiah made a decision that felt like the only sane choice left to him. He would be silent. No more prophecies, no more warnings, no more attempts to turn the hearts of a stubborn people back to their God. He would find a quiet corner of the world and live out his days in peace, letting others worry about the spiritual condition of the nation. The resolve felt good at first, like setting down a burden that had been crushing him. For several days, he said nothing about the visions that continued to come to him, ignored the urgings in his spirit to speak out against the injustices he witnessed. He tried to live like a normal person, to find satisfaction in simple pleasures and everyday concerns. But something strange began to happen. The more he tried to suppress the words God had given him, the more they seemed to burn within him. It was as if a fire had been kindled in his bones, a flame that grew hotter the more he tried to smother it. The visions wouldn't stop coming. The burden for his people wouldn't lift, and the words of God seemed to be blazing inside him like a furnace. "But if I say, I will not mention his word or speak any more in his name," he found himself whispering, "his word is in my heart like a fire shut up in my bones. I am weary of holding it in, indeed. I cannot. The realization came to him gradually, like dawn breaking over the mountains. He couldn't stop being a prophet any more than he could stop being human. This wasn't just something he did. It was who he was. God had formed him in the womb for this purpose, had written this calling into the very fabric of his being. To deny it would be to deny himself, to attempt to live as someone he was never meant to be. But more than that, he began to understand that his struggles and sufferings were not signs that he had failed in his calling, but evidence that he was fulfilling it exactly as God intended. The potter sometimes had to apply intense heat to the clay to make it strong and durable. The fire in his bones wasn't a punishment. It was the very thing that qualified him to speak for God. "The Lord is with me like a mighty warrior," he declared, his voice growing stronger with each word. "So my persecutors will stumble and not prevail. They will fail and be thoroughly disgraced. Their dishonour will never be forgotten." The change in perspective was revolutionary. Instead of seeing his sufferings as evidence of God's abandonment, Jeremiah began to understand them as proof of God's presence. The fire in his bones wasn't consuming him. It was refining him, purifying him, making him into the kind of vessel that could carry God's words to a broken world. He thought again of the potter's house, of the way Malachi had worked the clay with such patience and skill. Sometimes the potter had to put the vessel into the fire to make it strong, to burn away the impurities and set the shape permanently. The heat wasn't cruelty, it was love, the kind of love that was willing to do whatever it took to create something beautiful and lasting. "I will speak," Jeremiah said aloud, his voice carrying across the quiet grove. "I will speak because I must, because the words are like fire in my bones, because God has made me a prophet to the nations. I will speak not because it's easy, but because it's necessary. I will speak not because people want to hear, but because they need to hear. I will speak because the potter is still at work and I am his instrument." The fire in his bones had become not a burden, but a gift, not a curse, but a blessing. It was the very thing that enabled him to continue when everything else told him to quit, the divine energy that sustained him through rejection and persecution. He was not just a messenger, he was a burning message, a living embodiment of God's passionate love for his people. The years passed, and Jeremiah's prophecies began to unfold with heartbreaking accuracy. The Babylonian army, led by King Nebuchadnezzar, laid siege to Jerusalem just as God had warned through his prophet. The city that had been called the joy of the whole earth was now surrounded by enemy forces, its people trapped within walls that had once seemed impregnable. During the siege, Jeremiah found himself in an impossible position. His prophecies of judgment were being fulfilled before everyone's eyes, but instead of vindicating him, this only increased the hostility toward him. The leaders of Jerusalem accused him of being a traitor, of collaborating with the enemy by undermining morale with his gloomy predictions. "You're deserting to the Babylonians," they shouted when he tried to leave the city on a simple errand. They arrested him, beat him, and threw him into a dungeon where he remained for many days, forgotten and alone. But even in that dark place, the word of the Lord continued to come to him, and strangely, it was not a word of judgment, but of hope. "Call to me and I will answer you," came the familiar voice in the darkness. "I will tell you great and unsearchable things you do not know." The message that came to him there in the dungeon was one of the most beautiful and hopeful prophecies he had ever received. It spoke of a time when the city would be rebuilt, when the people would return from exile, when joy and celebration would once again fill the streets of Jerusalem. It was a promise of restoration so complete and wonderful that it seemed almost too good to be true. "I will bring health and healing to it," God promised. "I will heal my people and will let them enjoy abundant peace and security. I will bring Judah and Israel back from captivity, and will rebuild them as they were before. I will cleanse them from all the sin they have committed against me, and will forgive all their sins of rebellion against me. Then this city will bring me renown, joy, praise and honour before all nations on earth that hear of all the good things I do for it." Even as the sounds of warfare grew louder outside his prison walls, Jeremiah held on to these words of hope. The potter was still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the broken clay of human hearts and human history. When the city finally fell, it was as devastating as Jeremiah had predicted. The temple was destroyed, the walls torn down, the leaders killed or carried away into exile. The sight of Jerusalem in ruins was almost more than the prophet could bear. This was the city where God had chosen to dwell, the place where his people had worshipped for centuries. Now it lay in smoking rubble, its streets filled with the debris of a civilization that had forgotten its God. In the aftermath of the destruction, Jeremiah sat among the ruins and wept. The tears came not from a heart that said, "I told you so," but from one that was genuinely broken for the suffering of his people. He had warned them, yes, but he had never wanted to see them destroyed. He had hoped until the very end that they would turn back to God and avoid this terrible fate. It was then that he began to write what would become known as the Book of Lamentations, a collection of funeral songs for a dead city, poems of grief and mourning that captured the full depth of the tragedy that had befallen Jerusalem. But even in the midst of this profound sorrow, hope refused to be extinguished. "Because of the Lord's great love we are not consumed," he wrote, his hand trembling as he formed the words, "for his compassions never fail. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness." The words seemed to come from somewhere deeper than his own understanding, as if the Spirit of God was using his human grief to express a divine truth that transcended the immediate circumstances. Yes, Jerusalem had fallen. Yes, the people were scattered and the temple destroyed. But God's love had not failed. His faithfulness had not ended. His compassions were indeed new every morning, even in the darkest of times. "The Lord is good to those whose hope is in him," he continued, "to the one who seeks him. It is good to wait quietly for the salvation of the Lord." As he wrote these words, Jeremiah began to understand something profound about the nature of hope. It wasn't based on circumstances or on the absence of suffering. True hope was rooted in the character of God himself, in his unchanging love and faithfulness. The potter might allow the clay to be broken, but he would never abandon it. He might permit the vessel to be shattered, but only so that he could create something even more beautiful from the pieces. "For no one is cast off by the Lord forever," he wrote, his voice growing stronger with each word. "Though he brings grief, he will show compassion. So great is his unfailing love. For he does not willingly bring affliction or grief to anyone." The ruins of Jerusalem became, in a strange way, a place of worship for Jeremiah. There among the broken stones and scattered debris, he found a closeness to God that he had never experienced before. The external symbols of faith were gone, but faith itself remained. The building had been destroyed, but the builder continued his work. People would come to him there, survivors of the siege who were struggling to make sense of what had happened. They would ask him why God had allowed such suffering, why the innocent had to pay for the sins of the guilty, why the city of God had been given over to pagan armies. "I cannot answer all your questions," Jeremiah would tell them gently, "but I can tell you what I have learned in my years of walking with the Lord. He is like a potter who shapes clay, and sometimes the shaping process is painful. But he never works without purpose, and he never abandons what he has begun. The vessel may be broken, but the potter's hands are still at work creating something new from the pieces." In the final years of his life, Jeremiah found himself in Egypt, carried there against his will by a group of Jewish refugees who feared remaining in the land of Judah. It was not where he had expected to end his days, far from the city he had loved and served for so many years. But even in this foreign land, he continued to speak the words God gave him, continued to comfort and challenge the people who had been scattered by the winds of history. As he sat one evening by the banks of the Nile watching the sunset over the ancient land of the Pharaohs, Jeremiah reflected on the long journey that had brought him to this place. He was no longer the young man who had trembled beneath the olive tree at his first calling. His hair was now white, his hands marked by years of writing and rewriting God's words, his heart scarred by decades of rejection and persecution. But he was not bitter. Somehow, through all the pain and struggle, he had learned to see his life as part of a larger tapestry that God was weaving through history. He was just one thread in that tapestry, but he had been woven in exactly the right place, at exactly the right time, for exactly the right purpose. A young Jewish woman approached him as he sat by the water, her eyes reflecting the same uncertainty and pain he had seen in so many faces over the years. "Prophet," she said softly, "my heart is broken. I have lost everything. My home, my family, my future. How can I believe that God still cares about me?" Jeremiah smiled and gestured for her to sit beside him. "Let me tell you a story," he said, his voice warm with the wisdom of long experience. "Once God sent me to a potter's house to watch him work. The potter was shaping a vessel on his wheel, but something went wrong. The clay became marred, misshapen, useless for its intended purpose." The young woman leaned forward, intrigued despite her sorrow. "I expected the potter to throw the clay away," Jeremiah continued. "After all, it was ruined, wasn't it? But instead, he gathered it up and began again. He worked the clay, removed the impurities, and slowly shaped it into something new. The second vessel was different from the first, but it was beautiful in its own way. Perhaps even more beautiful because it bore the marks of the potter's patient love. "But what does this mean for me?" the woman asked. "How does this help me with my broken heart?" Jeremiah reached down and picked up a small piece of clay from the riverbank. "This is what God showed me that day," he said, working the clay gently in his hands. "You are not ruined. You are not beyond hope. You are clay in the potter's hands, and he is still shaping you. The breaking you've experienced is not the end of your story. It's the beginning of a new chapter." As he spoke, the clay in his hands began to take shape, becoming a small but perfectly formed vessel. "God's love is like this potter's skill," he continued. "It can take the most broken, damaged clay and create something beautiful from it. Your pain is not wasted. Your tears are not meaningless. They are part of the process by which God is making you into the person he always intended you to be." The woman began to weep, but they were not tears of despair. They were tears of hope, of recognition, of a heart that was beginning to heal. "How do you know this?" she whispered. "How can you be so sure?" Jeremiah smiled, and in that smile was the peace of a man who had wrestled with God and found him faithful. "Because I have been clay in the potter's hands for 40 years, he said simply. "I have been broken and reshaped more times than I can count. I have questioned, doubted, even tried to run away from his calling. But through it all, I have learned one thing. The potter never gives up on his clay. He never throws it away. He keeps working, keeps shaping, keeps creating until the vessel is exactly what he envisioned it to be." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Jeremiah continued to speak with the young woman and others who had gathered around them. He told them of the promises God had made, of a time when the exiles would return, when the city would be rebuilt, when God would make a new covenant with his people. He reminded them that their current suffering was not the end of the story, but part of a larger narrative of redemption and restoration. "The potter is still at work," he said as the evening drew to a close. "In your lives, in the life of our nation, in the great sweep of history itself, he's shaping something beautiful from the clay of human hearts and human history. Trust his hands, yield to his touch, and know that whatever he is creating in you and through you, it will be more wonderful than you can imagine." That night, as Jeremiah lay down to sleep, he thought once more of the potter's house and the lesson that had shaped his entire ministry. He had been privileged to be God's messenger, to speak his words to a generation that desperately needed to hear them. He had endured rejection, persecution, and exile, but he had also experienced the incredible intimacy of walking with God through every trial. His life had not been easy, but it had been meaningful. He had been clay in the potter's hands, shaped and reshaped according to God's perfect will. And though he would not live to see the full fulfillment of the promises he had proclaimed, He knew with absolute certainty that the potter's work would continue. The hands that had shaped him would continue to shape others, generation after generation, until the final masterpiece was complete. The last words he wrote in his journal that night were these: "The steadfast love of the Lord never ceases. His mercies never come to an end. They are new every morning. Great is your faithfulness. The Lord is my portion, says my soul, therefore I will hope in him." And in the quiet darkness of a foreign land, far from the ruins of Jerusalem but close to the heart of God, Jeremiah slept peacefully, knowing that the potter's hands were still at work, still shaping, still creating something beautiful from the clay of human hearts. The message he had carried for 4 decades would outlive him, would speak to countless generations of broken people who needed to know that they were not beyond hope, that the potter never gives up on his clay, and that his love truly is new every morning. The story of Jeremiah reminds us that even in our darkest moments, even when our lives seem shattered beyond repair, we are never beyond the reach of the potter's hands. Like clay on the wheel, we may be broken, but we are never discarded. We are loved, shaped, and reshaped by hands that know exactly what we can become. And in the end, that is enough. That is everything. In the quietness of this story's end, may you find the peace that comes from knowing you too are clay in the potter's hands, being shaped with infinite love and patience into something beautiful beyond your wildest dreams. The potter is still at work, still shaping, still creating, and his love for you is new every morning. Hey everyone, welcome back to Sacred Slumber. Before we dive into tonight's story, I want to ask you something that would genuinely help us out. If you're enjoying this content, please consider using your hype points on this video. It really helps the channel more than you possibly know. Seriously, it makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people who love this kind of content. Also, if you want to, drop a comment telling us what time it is for you right now and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from. No pressure though, only if you feel like it. And of course, if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button. It keeps us going. All right, let's get into it. A whisper in the darkness. Imagine a night so quiet you can hear the oil lamps flickering. Picture a massive stone sanctuary in the ancient city of Shiloh, where shadows dance across walls that have witnessed centuries of worship. The air is thick with the scent of incense and burning oil, that peculiar combination of cedar smoke and olive essence that clings to sacred spaces. Outside, the wind moves through the hills of Israel like a whispered prayer, carrying with it the distant bleating of sheep settling for the night and the occasional call of a desert owl. Inside, in the sacred chambers near the Ark of the Covenant, a young boy lies sleeping on a simple mat. The stones beneath him still hold the warmth of the day's sun, though the night air has begun to cool. His breathing is steady, deep, the kind of sleep that comes from honest physical labour and a clear conscience. His name is Samuel. This is not a story about miracles that shake mountains or angels descending in blinding light. This is a story about something quieter, something more intimate, something that happens in the space between waking and dreaming, where the boundaries of reality become permeable. It is about a voice in the darkness, a child who learned to listen when the entire world had gone deaf, and a moment that would alter the spiritual trajectory of an entire nation. Because sometimes the most profound truths do not arrive with thunder and earthquake. Sometimes they do not announce themselves with burning bushes or pillars of fire. Sometimes they arrive in whispers, in the stillness between breaths, in the gentle calling of a name spoken 3 times before it is finally understood. What you're about to hear is one of the most mysterious and beautiful moments in ancient scripture. A moment when heaven reached down to touch earth, not through spectacular signs, but through the simple act of calling a child's name in the night. But it is also a story about silence broken, about the end of a spiritual drought, about what happens when the divine decides to speak again after generations of absence. This is the story of Samuel, the boy who heard God speak when the rest of the world had forgotten how to listen, and perhaps, hidden within this ancient narrative, there are questions we have forgotten to ask. Questions about why heaven goes silent. Questions about who gets chosen to break that silence. Questions about whether the voice that called to Samuel in that darkened sanctuary is still calling, still speaking, still searching for those rare individuals who know how to say, "I am listening." Chapter 1. Hannah's Promise. To understand Samuel's calling, we must first understand how he came to be sleeping in that sanctuary. His story begins not with him, but with his mother, a woman named Hannah, who knew the bitter taste of desperation and the hollow ache of prayers that seemed to vanish into an empty sky. In the hill country of Ephraim, in a small village whose name has been lost to history, there lived a man named Elkanah who had 2 wives, as was common in that era. His first wife, Peninnah, had given him several children, sons to carry his name, daughters to arrange in marriage, a legacy written in flesh and blood. His second wife, Hannah, had given him only heartache and unanswered prayers. Year after year, Hannah remained childless, and in a culture where a woman's worth was often measured by her ability to bear children, this was not just a personal grief. It was a social death sentence, a daily humiliation, a question mark hanging over her entire existence. Neighbours would whisper, extended family would exchange knowing glances, even well-meaning friends would offer useless advice, or suggest that perhaps she had offended God in some way, that her barrenness was divine punishment for some unknown sin. Elkanah loved Hannah. The text makes this clear. He would give her double portions at feasts, trying to compensate with material generosity for what biology had denied her. He would ask her with genuine confusion, "Am I not better to you than 10 sons?" It was a question born of love but blind to understanding. He could not fathom that the issue went deeper than his affection, that Hannah's grief was not about him at all, but about her own sense of purpose, of completion, of being seen as fully human by the society around her. Peninnah, with the cruelty that can only come from insecurity dressed as triumph, would taunt Hannah relentlessly. Every time the family made their annual pilgrimage to the sanctuary at Shiloh to worship and offer sacrifices, Peninnah would remind Hannah of her barrenness. The taunts were not subtle. They were designed to cut deep, to remind Hannah that in the eyes of the world she was incomplete, cursed, forgotten by the very God she came to worship. Peninnah would parade her children before Hannah, would make comments about how blessed she was, would turn every moment of worship into a reminder of Hannah's failure. And Hannah would weep. She would refuse to eat. The pain went beyond physical longing for a child. It touched something deeper, the existential question that haunts anyone who feels overlooked by the divine. Does God see me? Does he hear my prayers? Am I worthy of his attention? Or am I simply background noise in a universe too vast to care about one woman's grief? The pilgrimage to Shiloh was supposed to be a time of joy, of celebration, of renewal. But for Hannah, it became an annual reminder of everything she lacked. Year after year she would go through the motions of worship, while her heart broke quietly in places no one could see. One year, during their pilgrimage to Shiloh, Hannah could bear it no longer. The weight of accumulated grief, the years of disappointment, the constant humiliation, all of it reached a breaking point. While the rest of the family feasted after the sacrifice, celebrating with wine and roasted meat, Hannah slipped away to the entrance of the sanctuary. She stood there, in the place where earth met heaven, in the threshold between the mundane and the sacred, and she prayed with an intensity that went beyond words. Her lips moved, but no sound emerged. Her whole body shook with the force of her grief and desperation. Tears streamed down her face. Her hands trembled. This was not the polite, ritualized prayer of public worship. This was raw, unfiltered communion with the divine. This was a woman pouring out her soul, holding nothing back, demanding to be heard by a God who had seemed deaf to her pleas for years. She made a vow that day, one that would echo through generations. If God would grant her a son, she would give him back to God. Not for a season, not for a few years, but for his entire life. The child would be dedicated to divine service from the moment he was weaned. It was the prayer of a woman who understood that sometimes the greatest gift we can receive is not something to hold on to, but something to offer back to its source. She was not bargaining with God so much as she was declaring her willingness to participate in something larger than her own desires. Eli, the high priest, sat by the doorpost of the sanctuary and watched this strange woman swaying and muttering. In his aging, perhaps cynical view of human nature shaped by years of dealing with corrupt worshippers and his own corrupt sons, he assumed she was drunk. The accusation was harsh, almost cruel. "What are you doing here, intoxicated in the house of the Lord? How dare you bring your drunkenness into this sacred space?" Hannah lifted her eyes, and in them Eli saw not the glaze of wine, but the clarity of absolute desperation. The look of someone who has nothing left to lose, who has stripped away all pretense and pride, who stands naked before God with only their need. She explained that she was not drunk, but deeply troubled, pouring out her soul before God. She had been praying out of her great anguish and grief. Something in her words, or perhaps in her eyes, or perhaps in the raw authenticity of her pain, convinced Eli. His response was both blessing and prophecy. "Go in peace, and may the God of Israel grant what you have asked of him." It is unclear whether Eli knew what he was saying, whether he was simply offering the standard priestly blessing, or whether something moved through him in that moment. Some whisper of the divine speaking through a man who had grown complacent in his religious duties. But the words landed on Hannah like rain on parched earth. Hannah left the sanctuary that day transformed. Her face was no longer downcast. She ate. The grief lifted from her countenance like a fog dispersing under the morning sun. She had been heard, if not by man, then by something infinitely greater. She did not yet have the child she longed for, but she had something perhaps more precious. The certainty that her prayers had reached their destination, that her voice had penetrated the silence, that she mattered to the God she served. Within the year, Hannah conceived. When she gave birth to a son, she named him Samuel, which in Hebrew carries the meaning heard by God, or asked of God, or some translations suggest name of God. The name itself was a testimony, a permanent reminder that this child was an answer to prayer, a gift that came from somewhere beyond the ordinary workings of the world. Every time someone spoke his name, they were acknowledging that this boy represented the moment when heaven responded to earth, when silence gave way to acknowledgement. For the first few years of his life, Samuel remained with Hannah. She nursed him, taught him his first words, held him close during thunderstorms, watched him take his first steps, knowing that each day brought them closer to the moment of separation. She must have memorized the sound of his laugh, the feel of his small hand in hers, the weight of him sleeping against her chest. She was not raising a son to keep, but a son to give away, and that knowledge must have coloured every moment with a bittersweet intensity. When he was old enough to be weaned, somewhere around 3 years old by the customs of that time, Hannah kept her vow. She could have rationalised her way out of it. She could have argued that God understood, that the vow was made in a moment of emotional extremity, that surely keeping her son would be acceptable. But Hannah was a woman who understood that integrity means keeping promises even when they cost you everything. She took Samuel to Shiloh. She brought him before Eli, the same priest who had blessed her years earlier, and she said words that must have torn her heart even as she spoke them. "I am the woman who stood here praying. I prayed for this child, and the Lord has granted me what I asked. So now I give him to the Lord. For his whole life he will be given over to the Lord." Then Hannah sang, not a lament, but a song of triumph and praise. She sang of God overturning the proud and lifting up the humble. She sang of barren women bearing children and the powerful being brought low. She sang of the Lord bringing death and giving life, bringing down to the grave and raising up. She sang of God judging the ends of the earth, giving strength to his king and exalting his anointed. Her song was radical, revolutionary, a declaration that the God she served delighted in reversing the expectations of the world, in using the weak to shame the strong, in lifting up those the world had written off as irrelevant. And then she left her son in that sanctuary and went home. Imagine being that child, too young to fully understand why your mother brought you to this vast, echoing building filled with strange smells and unfamiliar faces and then walked away. Too young to grasp that you had become the physical embodiment of a promise, a living prayer offered back to its source. You watch her figure receding, growing smaller, disappearing down the road back to the only home you have ever known, and you are left in the care of an old man whose eyes can barely see you, whose own sons are corrupt, in a place that will become your entire world. Samuel's childhood was unlike any other in Israel. While other boys played in fields and learned their father's trades, running through olive groves and swimming in streams, Samuel grew up in the sacred space of the tabernacle. His world was one of ritual and reverence, of ancient objects and whispered prayers, of shadows and lamplight, and the constant awareness that this place was different from all other places. He opened the doors of the sanctuary each morning, flooding the holy space with light. It was his job to unlock the heavy wooden doors that sealed the sacred from the profane, to let in the dawn and with it the worshippers who would come seeking connection with the divine. He assisted Eli in the daily tasks of worship, learning the intricate patterns of sacrifice and ceremony, memorizing which offerings required which procedures, understanding the difference between sin offerings and burnt offerings and peace offerings, learning to read the subtleties of ritual purity. He tended the lamps that burned through the night, ensuring their wicks were trimmed and their oil replenished. This was not glamorous work. It required attention to detail, a willingness to wake in the darkness to check that the flames had not guttered out, an understanding that these small acts of maintenance were what kept the sacred space functioning. The lamps represented the presence of God, and Samuel learned that presence requires constant tending, constant attention, constant care. He cleaned the sacred vessels, swept the courts, washed the linens used in ceremonies, helped prepare the incense, carried water, ran errands. He memorized scriptures, learning to recite the stories of Abraham and Isaac and Jacob, the tales of Moses and the Exodus, the laws given at Sinai. His education was entirely religious, entirely focused on service, entirely oriented towards something beyond himself. By all accounts, Samuel was a good child, humble, obedient, faithful in small things. The text tells us he grew in favour with both the Lord and with people. He was not resentful of his circumstances. He did not seem to chafe against the boundaries of his unusual childhood. Perhaps he had accepted that this was simply who he was, the boy who belonged to God, the boy who lived in the house of the Lord. But what must it have been like psychologically? To have no mother to comfort you when you woke from nightmares, to have no siblings to quarrel and play with, to grow up watching Eli's corrupt sons come and go, seeing the way they abused their position, hearing the whispers of their misconduct, to be surrounded by holiness and yet witness its corruption, to serve faithfully while those who should have been models of righteousness displayed only greed and lust and contempt for the sacred. Did Samuel wonder why he had been left here? Did he feel abandoned by the mother who had kissed him goodbye and walked away? Did he question whether the God he served even noticed his small acts of service? The text does not tell us. We see only the external facts. A boy growing up, performing his duties, learning his role. But surely there were moments of loneliness, moments of doubt, moments when the weight of it all felt too heavy for small shoulders to carry. Hannah visited when she could. Each year during the family's annual pilgrimage to Shiloh, she would bring Samuel a new robe she'd made for him, watching him grow, trying to compress a year of mothering into a few brief encounters. These visits must have been both blessing and torment. The joy of seeing his mother mingled with the pain of watching her leave again. The new robe, a reminder that somewhere he had a home, a family, a life he was not permitted to live. Yet there is no indication that Samuel rebelled or resented his circumstances. He simply continued. Day after day, year after year, faithful in the small things, present in the sacred space, available to be used however God saw fit. There was no indication in those early years that he would become anything more than a helpful assistant to an aging priest, that he would one day be the voice through which God spoke to an entire nation. But God, it seems, has a habit of preparing his instruments in obscurity before bringing them into the light. Samuel was being shaped by his circumstances, formed by his loneliness, refined by his faithfulness in tasks that no one celebrated. He was learning what it meant to serve without applause, to be obedient without immediate reward, to remain present even when presence felt like punishment. He was learning to listen in the silence. Chapter 2. The State of Israel at the Time. To appreciate what happened on that quiet night when God called Samuel's name, you need to understand the spiritual condition of Israel during this period. It was, to put it simply, a disaster. But the disaster raises uncomfortable questions that the text never fully answers. Questions about divine silence. Questions about why systems of worship become corrupt. Questions about what happens when the mediators between heaven and earth become obstacles instead of conduits. The problem started with Eli's sons, Hophni and Phinehas. These two men had inherited their father's position as priests, but they had not inherited his reverence for the sacred. They were corrupt in ways that went beyond simple moral failing. They actively perverted the worship of God, treating the sacrifices and offerings as opportunities for personal gain, turning the sacred into the profane with a systematic cruelty that suggests something darker than mere greed. When people brought animals to sacrifice at Shiloh, the priests were entitled to a specific portion of the meat according to the law of Moses. But Hophni and Phinehas were not content with their allotted share, with what had been designated as rightfully theirs. They wanted more. They wanted the best. They wanted what belonged to God. They would send their servants to threaten worshippers, demanding the choicest cuts of meat before the fat was even burned on the altar, as required by law. The fat belonged to God. That was non-negotiable in the sacrificial system. The burning of the fat was the moment when the sacrifice became truly sacred, when the offering transitioned from human gift to divine acceptance. But Hophni and Phinehas did not care about divine acceptance. They cared about their appetites. If people objected, if they tried to follow the proper procedures and insist that the fat be burned first, the servants would respond with threats of violence. We will take it by force if necessary. The priests were literally stealing from God, taking what belonged to the altar and consuming it themselves. They were turning worship into extortion, using their position of spiritual authority to exploit the vulnerable and the faithful. But their corruption went even darker, into territories that the text only hints at with uncomfortable brevity. They engaged in sexual immorality with women who served at the entrance to the sanctuary. These were women who had dedicated themselves to service at the tabernacle, who came to worship and serve with sincere devotion. And Hophni and Phinehas exploited them, used their authority and position to prey upon those who should have been under their protection. They turned the house of God into a place of exploitation and abuse, where the very people who were supposed to represent divine holiness became perpetrators of trauma. Worship became a source of fear rather than transcendence. People stopped coming, or when they came with cynicism and resentment, going through the motions but empty of faith. How could you trust a system where the gatekeepers were predators? How could you believe in the holiness of a place where the priests defiled it daily? The sanctuary at Shiloh, which was meant to be the central hub of Israel's spiritual life, became instead a monument to religious corruption. Eli knew what his sons were doing. The text makes this painfully clear. People told him. They came with reports of misconduct, of abuse, of exploitation. He heard the rumours and saw the evidence. He was not ignorant. He was not blind to their crimes. And to his credit, he confronted them. But his rebukes were weak, almost apologetic, carrying no weight and no consequence. Why do you do such things? I hear reports from the people about your wicked deeds. If someone sins against another person, God may mediate. But if someone sins against the Lord, who will intercede? The words acknowledge the problem but offer no solution. There is no threat of removal from office, no stripping of authority, no punishment that might actually deter the behaviour. Just words, just disappointment, just a father hoping his wayward sons might suddenly develop a conscience they had never demonstrated. Hophni and Phinehas ignored their father and continued their corruption. Why wouldn't they? There were no consequences. Eli's position as high priest gave him the authority to remove them, to appoint others, to enforce standards. But he did nothing, and his inaction was itself a form of action, a choice that enabled the continued degradation of worship. The impact on Israel's spiritual life was catastrophic. The text records it with devastating simplicity. The people came to despise the offerings to the Lord. Think about what that means. The sacrificial system was the heart of Israel's covenant relationship with God. It was how sins were atoned for, how gratitude was expressed, how the community maintained its connection with the divine. And people were learning to despise it, to see it as corrupt and meaningless, to associate worship with exploitation rather than with holiness. Faith withered. Cynicism spread. A generation was growing up believing that God either did not care about corruption in his own house, or that he was powerless to stop it, or worse, that he did not exist at all, and the whole system was simply a mechanism for priestly power and exploitation. But perhaps the most devastating aspect of this era, the detail that haunts the narrative with its implications, was not the corruption of the priests. It was the silence of heaven. The scripture records it with haunting simplicity. In those days, the word of the Lord was rare. There were not many visions. Think about what that means. In a culture where prophets and priests were meant to be the conduits between God and humanity, the channel had gone quiet. God was not speaking, or if he was, no one was hearing. Prophecies were scarce to the point of being legendary. Divine visions were so uncommon that when someone claimed to have received one, it was met with skepticism rather than expectation. But why? The text does not explain. It simply records the fact of divine silence as if it were weather, as if the absence of God's voice was as natural and unremarkable as a drought. But this raises uncomfortable questions. Had God withdrawn because of the corruption? Was the silence a form of judgment, a divine turning away from a people who had corrupted worship? Or had the people simply stopped listening? Had they become so cynical and so wounded by a religious hypocrisy that they could no longer hear what was being said? Or was there another possibility, one that the text does not explore but that hangs in the air like smoke? Perhaps the priests, who were supposed to be the mediators between God and people, had become such effective blockers of communication that divine messages simply could not get through. Perhaps Hophni and Phinehas were not just corrupt individuals, but symptoms of a systemic failure, a spiritual infrastructure that had collapsed under the weight of its own contradictions. Israel was spiritually adrift, navigating by dead reckoning through waters where the stars had gone dark. There were no prophets to consult, no clear word from God about how to proceed, no divine guidance about which way to turn, just the daily grind of existence, the hollow rituals performed without meaning, the slow death of a people's faith in the face of institutional betrayal. This was the world into which Samuel was growing up, a world where the representatives of God were corrupt, where worship had become hollow, where heaven seemed distant and disinterested. If you were a young person in that era, what would you believe about the divine? Would you expect God to speak? Would you even know what his voice sounded like? Would you be able to distinguish a divine call from your own imagination or from the voice of a very human priest? Samuel cleaned the lamps each evening, ensuring the light would burn through the night. It was a practical task, a maintenance duty, nothing spiritual about it. He trimmed the wicks, refilled the oil reservoirs, ensured the flames were steady. But in that small act, there was a symbol that perhaps Samuel himself did not fully understand. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Somewhere in the darkness a light still burned, and into that darkness, cutting through the silence that had lasted for generations, a voice was about to break through. Chapter 3. The night God spoke. The night began like any other. Samuel had completed his duties for the day, working through the familiar routines that structured his life. The sanctuary was clean, the floors swept, the vessels washed and arranged in their proper places. The lamps were lit, their flames steady, casting dancing shadows across the ancient stones. The sacred space was prepared for the silence of the evening hours, for the long watch through darkness toward dawn. Eli, now elderly and nearly blind, his eyes grown dim from age and perhaps from seeing too much corruption without acting, had retired to his usual place. He moved slowly now, carefully, feeling his way along walls he had walked beside for decades. His sleeping area was separate but nearby, close enough that Samuel could hear him if he called, out in the night. Samuel lay down in his customary sleeping spot somewhere near the chamber where the Ark of the Covenant rested. The exact location is not specified in the text, but the implication is clear. He slept in proximity to the most sacred object in all of Israel, closer to the physical representation of God's presence than anyone else in the nation that night. The Ark was the most sacred object in Israel, a gold-covered chest containing the tablets of the law, a jar of manna, and Aaron's staff that had budded. But more than its contents, the Ark represented the very presence of God among his people. It was the throne of the invisible King, the place where heaven touched earth, the point of contact between the divine and the mortal. To sleep near it was to sleep in the shadow of holiness, though Samuel likely thought nothing of it. This was simply where he slept, as ordinary to him as any bedroom, as familiar as his own breathing. The lamp of God was still burning, casting flickering shadows across the stone walls. This detail matters more than it might initially seem. In the Jewish tradition, the lamp in the sanctuary, the menorah that burned with consecrated oil, was not allowed to go out until morning light made it unnecessary. It represented the presence of God, the light that persisted even in darkness, the hope that had not yet been extinguished. The phrase, "the lamp of God had not yet gone out," carries within it both promise and warning. Not yet, but it could. The light was still burning, but barely. The presence was still there, but fading. As long as the lamp burned, there was hope. As long as the light persisted against the encroaching darkness, God had not abandoned his dwelling place entirely. Samuel drifted into sleep, a boy exhausted from the honest labour of serving in the house of God. His breathing slowed, his muscles relaxed. He sank into that deep, dreamless sleep that comes from physical work and a clear conscience. The sanctuary around him settled into its nighttime sounds. The creak of cooling stone, the whisper of wind through high windows, the distant cry of a night bird, the soft flutter of the lamp flames, and then, in the darkness, cutting through the silence like a knife through cloth, he heard his name, Samuel. The voice was clear, distinct, personal. Not a shout that would echo through the halls, but not a whisper that could be mistaken for imagination either. It had the quality of someone standing nearby, speaking with intention and purpose, with the certainty that they would be heard. It was a voice that expected a response. Samuel's eyes snapped open. His heart leaped in his chest. There was no confusion, no moment of disorientation. He knew immediately that someone had called him. The voice had been too clear, too deliberate, too unmistakably directed at him. In the darkness, with the lamp casting its uncertain light, Samuel did what made perfect sense to a boy who had grown up serving under an elderly priest. Eli must need something. The old priest was nearly blind now, stumbling in the darkness. Perhaps he had dropped something. Perhaps he needed water. Perhaps he was unwell and required assistance. Samuel threw off whatever covering he used against the night chill and ran to where Eli slept. "Here I am. You called me?" The response was immediate, instinctive. "Here I am." Two words that would become the defining posture of Samuel's entire life. Not, "What do you want?" Not, "Can it wait until morning?" Just presence. Just availability. Here I am. Eli, pulled from sleep and confused, his mind foggy with the remnants of dreams, looked in the direction of Samuel's voice with eyes that could barely make out shapes in the darkness. "I did not call. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned to his place, perhaps a little puzzled, but not overly concerned. Perhaps he had been dreaming. Perhaps the transition from sleep to waking had jumbled his perceptions. Perhaps the old man had called out in his sleep and forgotten. These things happen. The mind plays tricks in the boundary spaces between consciousness and unconsciousness. He lay back down, pulled his covering around him, and closed his eyes, willing himself back towards sleep. The sanctuary settled back into silence. The lamp continued its steady burning. Outside, the wind moved through the hills with a sound like breathing. Samuel's heartbeat slowed back to its resting rhythm. Samuel? Again. The same voice, the same clarity, the same undeniable sense that someone was speaking directly to him, calling him by name with purpose and intention. This was not imagination. This was not the remnant of a dream clinging to the edge of waking. This was not the echo of Eli's voice misheard in the darkness. Someone had called his name clearly and deliberately, as real as the stone beneath him and the lamplight flickering against the walls. Once more, Samuel got up and went to Eli. His bare feet made soft sounds against the cold stone floor. His breathing was quicker now, his confusion deeper. If Eli had not called the first time, then who had? "Here I am. You called me." Eli, now more awake and perhaps slightly irritated at being disturbed a second time, sent him away again with a tone that suggested both confusion and mild frustration. "I did not call, my son. Go back and lie down." Samuel returned, but now there was a question forming in his mind that would not be silenced. If Eli was not calling him, then who was? Was someone playing a trick? Was there an intruder in the sanctuary hiding in the shadows, calling his name for some unknown purpose? But the voice had not seemed mischievous or threatening. It had been steady, certain, intimate, the kind of voice that knows you, that has the right to call your name. He lay back down, but this time sleep did not come easily. His eyes stayed open, staring into the darkness above him. His ears strained for any sound, any indication of who or what had spoken to him. The lamp flickered. A moth circled near its flame. Time stretched and compressed in that strange way it does when you are lying awake in the dark, unsure whether minutes or hours are passing. Samuel. The third time, Samuel abandoned any doubt or hesitation. Someone was calling him, and if it was not Eli, then perhaps the old priest was confused. Perhaps he was calling out without realizing it. Perhaps his dreams were speaking through him. Samuel got up once more, faster now, urgent, and went to Eli. He stood at the foot of the old priest's sleeping mat, his young face barely visible in the dim light that filtered in from the main chamber. "Here I am. You called me." And finally, after decades of serving in the sanctuary, after years of watching the word of the Lord become rare and vision scarce, after witnessing the corruption of his sons and the slow death of Israel's faith, Eli understood. The realization must have hit him like a physical blow. God was calling the boy, not the high priest, not the experienced religious leader, not the man who had served in this place for decades. The boy who cleaned the floors and tended the lamps and slept near the ark without fully comprehending what that meant. Eli's response is one of the most beautiful moments in the entire narrative. He could have been jealous, wounded by the divine bypassing, bitter that his years of service were being overlooked in favour of a child. He could have been defensive, questioning whether this was really happening, whether Samuel was perhaps confused or making things up. He could have claimed the voice for himself, insisted that any divine communication should come through proper channels, through the established hierarchy of priesthood. But instead, Eli became a teacher in the truest sense. He gave Samuel the gift of understanding and the words that would change everything. He put aside whatever personal feelings he might have had, and focused entirely on helping Samuel navigate what was about to happen. "Go and lie down," Eli said, and you can hear in those words both resignation and hope, both the sadness of being passed over and the wonder that God was speaking again at all. And if he calls you, say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening." Those words, "Speak, Lord, for your servant is listening," not "Who are you?" not "What do you want?" not "Prove yourself to me." Just openness, just availability, just the humble acknowledgement that if God is speaking, the only appropriate response is to listen. Samuel returned to his place one more time. He lay down in the darkness, the lamp of God still burning nearby. casting its uncertain light across ancient stones, and he waited. His heart must have been pounding so hard he could hear it in his ears. His mind must have been racing with questions and fears and wonder. What does the voice of God sound like? What will he say? Am I worthy to hear it? What if I do not understand? What if I get it wrong? The silence stretched. The lamp flickered. Outside, the night continued its slow progression toward dawn. And then, for the fourth time, the voice came. But this time there was a difference. This time the name was repeated, spoken twice, with an intimacy and urgency that had not been there before. Samuel! Samuel! The repetition is significant. In Hebrew, when a name is called twice, it indicates intimacy, urgency, importance. Abraham, Abraham, Moses, Moses. Now Samuel, Samuel. This was not a casual summons. This was personal, direct, unmistakable. This time, the boy was ready. Following Eli's instructions exactly, word for word, he responded with the words that have echoed through millennia as the perfect posture of faith, the ideal response to divine initiative. Speak, for your servant is listening. And God spoke. What happened next was not what a child would want to hear. God did not give Samuel a message of encouragement or blessing. He did not reveal some beautiful mystery or share some cosmic secret about the nature of reality or the structure of heaven. He did not offer comfort or promise Samuel a glorious future. Instead, God gave Samuel a prophecy of judgment, and the judgment was against Eli's household, against the man who had been like a father to him, against the only family he had truly known. God told Samuel that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. That phrase, ears tingling, suggests something shocking, something that would reverberate through the nation like a physical sensation. This was not going to be a quiet judgment, a private correction. This was going to be public, unmistakable, impossible to ignore. He was going to carry out against Eli everything he had spoken concerning his family, from beginning to end. There had been warnings before. A prophet had come to Eli years earlier with a similar message, speaking of judgment to come, of the priesthood being taken from his lineage, of his sons dying on the same day. That prophecy had been spoken and then seemingly forgotten, filed away as one of those uncomfortable truths that people acknowledge but never really expect to see fulfilled. But God was saying now that the time of fulfillment had come. The warnings were over. The judgment was at hand. The reason was clear and devastating. Eli knew about the sins of his sons. He knew they were blaspheming God, treating the sacred as profane, exploiting women, stealing from the altar, corrupting worship itself. He had heard the reports. He had seen the evidence. He had confronted them, yes, but his rebukes were empty, carrying no weight, leading to no consequences. He had failed to restrain them, failed to use his authority to stop them, failed to choose God's honour over his son's comfort, and that failure, that complicity through inaction, meant that the guilt of Eli's house would never be atoned for by sacrifice or offering. Think about what that means. In a religious system built entirely around sacrifice and atonement, where every sin could theoretically be covered by the blood of animals and the proper rituals, God was declaring that some corruption runs too deep for ritual to reach. Some betrayals are so fundamental that the system itself cannot address them. Eli's family would carry their guilt to the grave and beyond, marked forever by their choice to prioritize family loyalty over divine justice. Imagine being Samuel in that moment. You are a child, perhaps 11 or 12 years old, lying in the darkness of a sanctuary, having just heard the voice of God for the first time in your life. And the message you have been given is not one of blessing or calling or future glory. It is a message of doom for the man who has raised you, who has taught you everything you know about worship and service, who has been your only father figure in a life marked by abandonment and loneliness. The weight of it must have been crushing. How do you speak words of judgment to someone you love? How do you become the bearer of bad news that will break someone's heart? How do you look into the eyes of a man who has shown you kindness, and tell him that his family line is cursed, that his sons will die, that everything he has built will crumble. This was the cost of prophecy that no one talks about. This was the burden of truth that cannot be softened or avoided or delayed. Samuel had been given a message, and whether he wanted to deliver it or not was irrelevant. The truth had been spoken to him, and now he was responsible for speaking it to others. This is what it means to be a prophet. Not visions and mystical experiences and spiritual heights, but the grinding, awful responsibility of speaking truths that wound you as deeply as they wound those who hear them. The rest of the night must have been agony for Samuel. The text tells us he lay there until dawn, too afraid to tell Eli what he'd heard. He did not sleep. How could he? His mind must have raced through possibilities. Maybe he had misunderstood. Maybe there was a way to soften the message to make it less harsh. Maybe if he just kept quiet, the whole thing would fade like a dream, and he could go back to his simple life of tending lamps and sweeping floors. But deep down, he knew. The voice had been too clear. The message had been too specific. And God had not asked his opinion about whether this was a good idea or whether Samuel felt ready for such responsibility. The divine does not consult us about our readiness. It simply calls, and we must answer. Chapter 4. The Weight of the Message. As morning light began to filter into the sanctuary, pale and hesitant through the high windows, Samuel rose and went about his duties as usual. Muscle memory guided him through the familiar routines. He opened the doors of the house of the Lord, pushing aside the heavy wooden barriers that sealed the sacred from the profane, letting in the day, with all its ordinary demands. But everything felt different now. The air was heavier, pressing down on his shoulders like a physical weight. The silence was louder, filled with the words he carried but could not speak. He carried within him words that would change everything, and he was terrified to voice them. His hands shook as he performed his tasks. He fumbled with the lamp wicks, nearly spilling oil on the floor. He could not meet anyone's eyes. Every sound made him jump, expecting Eli to call for him, to demand the message, to force him to speak the unspeakable. Eli, however, knew something had happened. Years of serving in the sanctuary had given him an intuition about spiritual matters that his failing eyesight could not diminish. He could sense the change in Samuel, could feel the weight the boy was carrying. He called Samuel to him, his voice gentle but insistent, and when the boy came, reluctant and pale, the old priest asked him directly, "Samuel, my son, what was it he said to you? Please do not hide it from me." Then he added words that carried the weight of both authority and desperation. "May God deal with you, be it ever so severely if you hide from me anything he told you." It was an oath, a binding formula that made concealment impossible. Eli was not giving Samuel an easy out. He was demanding truth, however painful, however devastating. And in doing so, he was teaching Samuel one of the most important lessons of prophetic ministry. That truth matters more than comfort, that integrity requires speaking even when silence would be kinder. There is something deeply moving about this moment. Eli was giving Samuel permission to speak truth, even painful truth. He was not demanding a comfortable answer. He was not pressuring the boy to lie or soften the message. He was not using his position as high priest to intimidate or manipulate. He was simply asking for honesty, for the faithful delivery of whatever word had been given, regardless of personal cost. Samuel, to his credit, did not hold back. He told Eli everything, every word of the judgment, every detail of the coming consequences, every aspect of the doom pronounced against his house. He did not sugarcoat it. He did not try to make it easier to hear. He did not add comforting caveats or suggest ways the judgment might be avoided. He simply delivered the message as it had been given to him, faithful to both God and to Eli in his refusal to distort the truth. The words must have felt like stones in his mouth, each one heavy and sharp. He would have watched Eli's face as he spoke, looking for signs of anger or rejection or denial. But what he saw instead was something he had not expected. Eli's response is remarkable in its humility and resignation. He did not rage against the pronouncement. He did not question Samuel's experience or suggest the boy had misunderstood or imagined things. He did not blame Samuel for being the messenger or accuse him of disloyalty or ingratitude. He simply said, with a weariness that spoke of years of knowing this moment would come, "He is the Lord. Let him do what is good in his eyes." There is defeat in those words, yes, but there is also acceptance. A kind of peace that comes from finally having the truth spoken aloud, from no longer living in the shadow of unacknowledged reality. Eli had known for years that his sons were corrupt. He had known that his failure to stop them was a kind of complicity, a betrayal of his calling and his God. The judgment was not a surprise. It was an inevitability finally spoken aloud, a truth that had been hovering unspoken in the air for years finally given voice and substance. And perhaps in some way, Eli was relieved that the silence had been broken, even if the words spoken were words of judgment. Perhaps there is a relief that comes from knowing, from having certainty, even when that certainty is terrible. Perhaps after years of wondering when the hammer would fall, there was a strange comfort in finally hearing it fall, in knowing the shape of the future even when that future was dark. What Samuel learned that night and that morning was something most of us spend a lifetime avoiding. That truth is not always comfortable, that faithfulness sometimes means delivering hard words, and that love does not require us to hide reality from those we care about. Samuel could have lied to Eli. He could have softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details, or suggested that perhaps he had misunderstood what God was saying, but he chose honesty, and in doing so he established the pattern that would define his entire ministry. He would be a prophet who spoke the word of the Lord without compromise, without concern for how it would be received, without fear of the consequences. Not because he was harsh or unfeeling, but because he understood that truth, however painful, is ultimately an act of respect. To lie to someone, even to spare their feelings, is to treat them as less than fully human, as incapable of bearing reality. Samuel gave Eli the dignity of truth, and Eli received it with the dignity of acceptance. Chapter 5. Samuel becomes a prophet. After that night, everything changed for Samuel. The text tells us that he grew, and the Lord was with him, letting none of his words fall to the ground. That phrase, letting none of his words fall to the ground, is the ancient way of saying that everything Samuel prophesied came true. He was not speaking his own opinions or making educated guesses or offering the kind of vague predictions that could be interpreted multiple ways, depending on how events unfolded. He was speaking with divine authority, and reality itself confirmed his words with uncomfortable precision. The prophecy about Eli's house came true exactly as Samuel had spoken it. The details are grim and worth recounting because they establish Samuel's credibility as a true prophet in a time when false prophets were common and people had grown cynical about divine communication. Israel went to war against the Philistines, their perennial enemy. In the first battle, the Israelites were defeated and thousands of soldiers died. In desperation, the elders decided to bring the Ark of the Covenant from Shiloh to the battlefield, believing that God's physical presence would guarantee victory. Hophni and Phinehas accompanied the Ark, treating it like a magical talisman rather than the throne of the living God. The Israelites shouted when the Ark arrived, a roar so loud that the ground shook. The Philistines were terrified at first, knowing the stories of what the God of Israel had done to Egypt. But they fought anyway, and in the battle that followed, Israel was utterly defeated. 30,000 soldiers died, and on that same day, exactly as prophesied, both Hophni and Phinehas were killed. The Ark of God was captured by the Philistines, carried off as a trophy of war. When a messenger brought the news to Shiloh, Eli was sitting by the road, his heart trembling for the Ark of God. When he heard that the Ark had been captured and his sons were dead, the 98-year-old priest fell backward off his chair, broke his neck, and died. The priesthood of his line ended in that moment, cut off exactly as God had declared. It was a devastating fulfillment, but it established beyond doubt that Samuel spoke with divine authority. He had predicted these events when he was just a child, and they had come to pass exactly as he said. The word of the Lord through Samuel was reliable, trustworthy, deserving of attention. As Samuel matured from boy to young man, his reputation spread throughout Israel like wildfire. From Dan in the far north to Beersheba in the deep south, spanning the entire geographical extent of Israel's territory, everyone knew that Samuel had been established as a prophet of the Lord. The word that had been rare, the visions that had been scarce, now flowed through this young man who had learned to listen in the darkness. But Samuel was more than just a prophet delivering occasional messages. God continued to appear at Shiloh, revealing himself to Samuel through his word on a regular basis. Samuel became the primary channel of divine communication for the entire nation. The silence had been broken. The channel between heaven and earth, clogged by corruption and complacency for generations, had been cleared. And the instrument God chose was not a powerful warrior or a cunning politician or even an experienced priest with decades of religious training. It was a boy who had learned to say 5 simple words: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Samuel's influence on Israel cannot be overstated. He became the bridge between the chaotic era of the judges and the establishment of the monarchy, standing at one of the most critical transitions in the nation's history. He was the last judge, travelling on a circuit through Bethel, Gilgal and Mizpah, settling disputes and administering justice with a wisdom that people recognised as coming from God. He was also the first of the great prophets, the founder of a prophetic tradition that would produce Elijah, Elisha, Isaiah, Jeremiah, and all the voices that would call Israel back to God throughout its history. When the people demanded a king like the surrounding nations, it was Samuel who anointed Saul, a tall and handsome man from the tribe of Benjamin, as Israel's first king. And when Saul proved disobedient and unfaithful to God, it was Samuel who had to deliver yet another hard message of judgment, who had to watch another man he had elevated fall under divine displeasure. Later, it was Samuel who anointed David, the younger son of Jesse, a shepherd boy with no apparent qualifications except that God had chosen him. That shepherd boy would become Israel's greatest king, the man whose lineage would eventually produce the Messiah. But beyond the political role, beyond the anointing of kings and the settling of disputes, Samuel represented something Israel desperately needed: spiritual integrity in a world corroded by compromise. In a time when the priesthood had become corrupt, when worship had become hollow, when the word of the Lord was rare, Samuel embodied what it meant to hear from God and speak his truth faithfully regardless of personal cost. He reformed religious life throughout Israel, establishing schools of prophets where young men could learn to listen for God's voice and speak his word. He called the people back to authentic worship, challenging them to put away their foreign gods and serve the Lord only. He led the nation in repentance at Mizpah, where they fasted and confessed their sins, acknowledging that they had abandoned God. And when the Philistines attacked during that gathering, Samuel interceded for the people, and God threw the enemy into confusion with thunder and lightning, giving Israel a decisive victory. Samuel demonstrated that God had not abandoned his people, that the silence had been circumstantial rather than permanent, that divine presence and power were still available to those who would seek them with integrity. The boy who once cleaned floors and trimmed lamp wicks became the conscience of a nation. The child who slept near the ark became the voice through which God spoke to kings and commoners alike. His authority came not from position, or political power, or military might, but from the simple fact that he had learned to listen and had the courage to speak what he heard, even when speaking cost him dearly. Chapter 6. The Legacy of the Story. So what do we take from this ancient narrative? What does it mean for us, centuries removed from oil lamps and tabernacles and sleeping near the Ark of the Covenant? And perhaps more intriguingly, what questions does this story raise that it never fully answers? First, there is the theme of listening. God can speak in quiet places, in ordinary moments, when we least expect it. Samuel was not performing some elaborate spiritual ritual when God called his name. He was not fasting on a mountain. He was not in a trance or a vision quest. He was sleeping, exhausted from a day of mundane labour. He was simply present in a sacred space, available to be awakened. How often do we miss the voice of the divine because we are too busy, too distracted, too convinced that revelation only comes in spectacular packages? We wait for burning bushes and angelic visitations, for dramatic signs and unmistakable interventions, while the still small voice speaks in the darkness and we mistake it for our imagination, or for human conversation, or for nothing at all. Samuel teaches us that sometimes the most profound moments arrive softly, in the space between waking and sleeping, in the darkness when our defences are down and our minds are quiet enough to hear what has always been speaking. But this raises uncomfortable questions. How many times has that voice spoken and we have ignored it? How many times have we attributed divine communication to coincidence or psychology or wish fulfillment because we have lost the ability to recognise it for what it is? Second, there is the theme of obedience. Samuel's first response when he heard his name was immediate and complete. Here I am. No hesitation, no calculation, no weighing of options or considering whether this was a good time, just presence and availability. Not, what do you want, but here I am. Not, let me think about it, but immediate response. Later, when Eli gave him the words to use, Samuel followed the instruction exactly. He did not improvise or try to improve on the formula or insert his own personality into the exchange. He simply said what he had been taught to say: "Speak, for your servant is listening." Obedience in this story is not about blind submission to authority. It is about being teachable, about recognizing when someone knows more than you do, about trusting guidance even when you do not fully understand where it is leading. But there is something deeper here, something that troubles the waters of easy interpretation. Samuel was obedient to a voice he had never heard before, to a presence he could not see, based entirely on the instruction of a priest whose own family was corrupt, and whose judgment had been compromised by his failure to discipline his sons. What made Samuel so certain that this was God speaking, and not some other voice? What internal compass guided him toward trust, when skepticism would have been equally reasonable? Third, there is the theme of humility. Samuel's greatness began in small acts of service. He was faithful in opening doors, in cleaning, in tending lamps, in all the unglamorous work that keeps a sacred space functioning. He did not despise the small things, or consider himself above menial tasks. He swept floors with the same attention he later brought to anointing kings. He trimmed lamp wicks with the same care he would later exercise in delivering prophetic words, and it was in that posture of humble service, in the daily repetition of small faithful acts, that God found him. How different this is from our modern obsession with platform and visibility, with making a name for ourselves and ensuring everyone knows our accomplishments, with treating service as a stepping stone to something better rather than as its own reward. Samuel reminds us that true influence is built in obscurity, that character is formed in the small decisions no one sees, that greatness is the fruit of faithfulness in little things rather than the result of ambitious self-promotion. But again, there is a mystery here. Why Samuel? What was it about this particular boy that made him suitable for this calling? The text gives no indication that he was exceptional in any way. He was simply there, simply faithful, simply available. Which raises the question, are there others who are equally faithful, equally available, who never heard their name called? Is divine calling arbitrary, or is there some hidden criteria that determines who hears the voice and who does not? Fourth, there is the theme of responsibility. Sometimes truth is hard but necessary. Samuel's first message from God was a message of judgment, and he had to deliver it to someone he loved. This is the cost of being a conduit for truth. You do not get to choose which messages are convenient and which are difficult. You do not get to edit reality to make it more palatable. You do not get to withhold hard truths, because speaking them might damage relationships or cost you social capital. If you are going to be a voice for something beyond yourself, whether you call that voice God or conscience or truth, or simply what is, You have to be willing to speak even when the words cut you as deeply as they cut those who hear them. Samuel could have spared Eli. He could have lied or softened the message or claimed he did not remember the details. But he chose the harder path of honesty, and in doing so he honoured both Eli and himself. Yet this raises ethical questions that the narrative does not resolve. What is the balance between truth and compassion? When does speaking hard truths become cruelty disguised as honesty? Samuel was a child delivering a message he did not create and could not change. But what about us? When the truths we must speak are filtered through our own perceptions and biases and limited understanding, how do we know when to speak and when to remain silent? Fifth, there is the theme of hope. The lamp of God had not yet gone out. Even in the darkest period of Israel's spiritual life, when the priesthood was corrupt and the word of the Lord was rare and the nation was spiritually adrift, there was still a light burning somewhere in the darkness. God had not abandoned his people. He was simply waiting for someone who would listen, someone who would respond, someone who would be faithful with what was given to them. Samuel represents the truth that it is never too late for renewal, that no matter how far things have fallen, no matter how corrupt the systems or how cynical the people, there is always the possibility of a voice in the darkness calling us back to what matters. The light may be flickering, the wick may be nearly consumed, the oil may be running low. But as long as there is any light at all, there is hope for rekindling, for replenishment, for the dawn that follows even the longest night. But this optimistic reading sits uncomfortably with the historical reality. The lamp did eventually go out. The sanctuary at Shiloh was destroyed. The ark was captured and never returned to that place. The line of Eli ended in blood and disgrace. Samuel's calling did not prevent disaster. It only narrated it before it happened. So what kind of hope is this? Is it simply the hope that truth will be spoken, even if it changes nothing? Is it the hope that someone will bear witness, even in the midst of collapse? Finally, there is something unspoken in this narrative that deserves attention. God bypassed the entire religious hierarchy to speak to a child. He did not go through official channels. He did not honour the established order. He did not consult with the high priest or seek permission from religious authorities. He simply called out in the darkness to a boy who had no status, no authority, no credentials beyond faithfulness in small things. This is either deeply encouraging or deeply unsettling, depending on your perspective. It suggests that divine communication is not controlled by institutions, that truth can emerge from the margins, that the voice of God might speak to those we least expect, rather than to those we have designated as official intermediaries. But it also raises anarchistic questions about authority and order, about how we distinguish genuine divine calling from delusion or manipulation, about what happens when everyone claims to hear the voice of God speaking contradictory messages. Samuel's story is ultimately about availability. He was not the most powerful person in Israel. He was not the most educated or the most connected. He was simply present, attentive, and willing to respond when he heard his name called. And that was enough. That has always been enough. But it invites us to ask, what are we available for? What sacred spaces do we inhabit, whether physical or spiritual or psychological, where we might be found by whatever calls to us in the darkness? And when that call comes, will we recognize it, or will we mistake it for something ordinary, something explainable, something that requires no response? Epilogue, the voice in the night. Close your eyes and imagine that sanctuary again. The vast stone building in Shiloh, the oil lamps casting their gentle light, the shadows dancing on walls that have witnessed generations of worship and neglect. Imagine the boy lying near the ark, exhausted from a day of simple service, drifting into sleep with no expectation that this night will be different from any other. And then the voice, clear, personal, undeniable, a voice that breaks through the silence of heaven and calls a child by name. Samuel's story is a reminder that the divine does not always announce itself with thunder and lightning. Sometimes it comes as a whisper in the darkness. Sometimes it arrives in the form of a question repeated until we finally understand that we are being addressed. Sometimes the most significant moments of our lives happen when we are alone, unguarded, simply present in a space where we have made ourselves available to something greater than ourselves. The lamp of God is still burning. That is the promise embedded in this ancient narrative. No matter how dark the times, no matter how corrupt the systems, no matter how silent heaven seems, there is always a light somewhere refusing to go out, and there is always the possibility that in the quiet, in the stillness, in the spaces between our busy thoughts and desperate prayers, we might hear our name spoken by a voice we do not yet recognize. The question is not whether the voice is calling. The question is whether we are listening. Samuel lay in that sanctuary as a boy and became a prophet because he learned to say 5 words that changed everything. Speak, for your servant is listening. He did not demand proof. He did not negotiate terms. He did not insist on understanding everything before committing to anything. He simply made himself available, and availability was enough. Perhaps that is the real legacy of Samuel's calling. Not that he became powerful or influential or historically significant, though he became all those things. The real legacy is that he teaches us what it looks like to be genuinely open to transformation, to be willing to hear hard truths, to be faithful in small things while waiting for larger purposes to reveal themselves. In our age of constant noise and perpetual distraction, where silence is something to be feared rather than cherished, Samuel's story feels almost subversive. It suggests that the most important communications might not come through our devices or our carefully curated information streams. They might come in the quiet, in the dark, in the moments when we stop performing and simply exist in the presence of something that knows our name. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, consider the possibility that you, too, might be lying in a sacred space, even if you do not recognize it as such. Consider the possibility that there might be a voice, gentle and persistent, calling your name in the darkness. Consider the possibility that the most profound transformation of your life might not begin with a grand revelation or a spectacular sign, but with the simple decision to respond to that voice with 5 words. Speak, for your servant is listening. The lamp is still burning. The voice is still calling. The only question is whether we have ears to hear.
Hello, dear listener, and welcome to Sacred Slumber. Before we begin tonight's story, I'd love to know how your day has been. Whatever time it is where you are in the world, whether you're settling in for the evening or finding a quiet moment during your day, you're exactly where you need to be. We have listeners joining us from every corner of the globe, and it's beautiful to think that we're all connected through these ancient stories that continue to speak to our hearts today. If this story brings you peace and you'd like to hear more like it, please consider subscribing to Sacred Slumber. Now let us journey back over 3,000 years to a time when the hills of ancient Israel echoed with the cries of an oppressed people, and discover how God chose the most unlikely hero to deliver them. The sun blazed mercilessly over the barren hills of ancient Israel, its heat seeming to mock the suffering people below. For 7 long years, the shadow of oppression had fallen across the promised land, like a plague that would not lift. The Midianites, fierce nomadic warriors from the desert, had swept down upon Israel like locusts, devouring everything in their path. In caves carved into limestone cliffs, families huddled in darkness, their faces gaunt with hunger and hollow with despair. Children, who should have been playing in village squares instead, learned to recognize the distant thunder of approaching hoofbeats, the signal to flee deeper into their rocky refuges. The once fertile valleys that had flowed with milk and honey now lay trampled and barren, stripped clean by the endless raids of their oppressors. The Israelites had forgotten what it meant to harvest their own crops. Each year they would plant in hope, tending their fields with trembling hands, always listening for the sound that would send them running. And each year, just as the grain began to ripen, the Midianites would come. They arrived like a sandstorm, their camels innumerable as the sand by the sea, their warriors dark silhouettes against the burning sky. They took everything, left nothing, and vanished back into the wilderness, leaving behind only dust and desperation. In this time of darkness, when hope seemed as distant as the stars, there lived a young man named Gideon. He was not what anyone would call a mighty warrior. His hands, though calloused from labour, had never gripped a sword in battle. His shoulders, though broad from years of farm work, had never carried the weight of armour. His eyes, though keen from watching the horizon for danger, had never gazed unflinchingly into the face of an enemy. On this particular day, Gideon found himself doing what had become all too common among his people. Hiding. He was in his father's wine press, a stone basin carved deep into the earth, meant for treading grapes. But instead of the purple stain of harvest, this hollow held only wheat stalks and the sound of desperate threshing. Gideon worked quickly, quietly, glancing nervously toward the rim of the pit above him. This was no place to thresh grain, but it was hidden from watching eyes, concealed from raiders who might snatch away even this meagre portion of food. The irony was not lost on him. Here he was, a descendant of Abraham, to whom God had promised this very land, reduced to working in secret, like a thief in his own inheritance. The wheat he threshed was barely enough to keep his family alive, and even this small amount had to be hidden from those who would steal it away. As Gideon worked, sweat dripping from his brow to mingle with the grain dust, he wondered where the God of his fathers had gone. The elders still told stories around carefully concealed fires, stories of a time when the Lord had parted the sea, when he had brought down the walls of Jericho, when his presence had dwelt among them in power and glory. But those seemed like tales from another world, stories of a God who had perhaps grown tired of his people and turned his face away. The rhythmic sound of the flail striking grain filled the small space, a lonely percussion that seemed to echo the beating of his own discouraged heart. Each strike felt like a prayer he didn't know how to voice, a desperate plea to heaven from a pit in the earth, and then without warning, the monotonous rhythm was broken by a voice. "The Lord is with you, mighty warrior." Gideon's flail froze mid-swing. His heart hammered against his ribs as he spun around, expecting to see a Midianite soldier who had discovered his hiding place. Instead, he saw a figure sitting beneath the oak tree above the winepress, a man whose presence seemed to make the very air shimmer with an otherworldly light. The stranger's words echoed in Gideon's mind. Mighty warrior? Him? The man who threshed wheat in secret, who started at shadows, who had never held anything more dangerous than farming tools? Surely this visitor was either mocking him or mistaken about who he was addressing. Gideon climbed slowly from the winepress, his legs unsteady, not from exertion, but from the strange presence of this visitor. The man beneath the oak appeared ordinary enough, yet something in his bearing, something in the way the light seemed to gather around him, spoke of anything but ordinary humanity. "Pardon me, my lord," Gideon said, his voice betraying his confusion and fear. "But if the Lord is with us, why has all this happened to us? Where are all his wonders that our ancestors told us about when they said, 'Did not the Lord bring us up out of Egypt? But now the Lord has abandoned us and given us into the hand of Midian.'" The words tumbled out of him like water breaking through a dam. 7 years of bottled frustration, 7 years of unanswered prayers, 7 years of watching his people suffer, while heaven remained silent. If this stranger claimed the Lord was with them, then where was the evidence? Where was the God who had once fought for Israel with fire and earthquake, with angel armies and miraculous interventions? The figure beneath the oak tree regarded him with eyes that seemed to hold depths of understanding far beyond human measure. When he spoke, his voice carried an authority that made the ground beneath Gideon's feet feel somehow more solid, as if reality itself paid attention to his words. "Go in the strength you have and save Israel out of Midian's hand. Am I not sending you?" Gideon felt his knees nearly buckle. Save Israel? Him? The man who hid in wine presses, who jumped at the sound of the wind through the barley? This had to be some terrible mistake, some cosmic error in judgment. "Pardon me, my lord," he said again, his voice barely above a whisper, "but how can I save Israel? My clan is the weakest in Manasseh, and I am the least in my family." It was true. His family held no position of honour among the tribe. They owned no great flocks, commanded no respect in the councils of the elders. Gideon himself was the youngest son, the one who tended to mundane tasks while others made important decisions. He was nobody special, nobody who mattered, nobody whom anyone would follow into battle. But the mysterious visitor seemed unmoved by these protests. "I will be with you," he said simply, "and you will strike down all the Midianites, leaving none alive." The promise hung in the air between them, impossible and overwhelming. Gideon's mind reeled as he tried to comprehend what was being asked of him. But if this was truly a messenger from the Lord, if this was indeed the God of his fathers speaking to him, then surely he could ask for some sign, some proof that this wasn't merely the product of too much sun and too little food. "If now I have found favour in your eyes," Gideon said carefully, "give me a sign that it is really you who speaks with me. Please do not go away until I come back and bring my offering and set it before you." The figure nodded gravely. "I will wait until you return." Gideon hurried to his house, his heart pounding with a mixture of terror and desperate hope. He prepared what he could offer: a young goat, unleavened bread made from precious flour, broth to complete the meal. It was a significant sacrifice for a family that had so little, but if there was even the slightest chance that the God of Israel was truly speaking to him, no cost was too great. When he returned to the oak tree, the stranger was still there, patient as stone, eternal as the hills. Gideon set the meat on a rock, poured out the broth, and waited to see what would happen. The visitor extended the staff in his hand and touched the meat and bread. Instantly, fire flared up from the rock, consuming the offering completely. In the same moment, the figure vanished from sight, leaving Gideon alone with the blackened stone and the certain terrifying knowledge that he had been speaking with an angel of the Lord. "Alas, sovereign Lord," Gideon cried out, falling to his knees, "I have seen the angel of the Lord face to face." But even as fear overwhelmed him, a voice spoke from heaven itself. "Peace, do not be afraid, you are not going to die." Gideon built an altar there and called it "The Lord is Peace," but peace was far from what he felt in his heart. That very night, the Lord spoke to him again, commanding him to tear down his father's altar to Baal and cut down the Asherah pole beside it. It was to be his first act of obedience, his first step toward the impossible task that lay ahead. Under cover of darkness, accompanied by 10 servants, Gideon did as he was commanded. They worked quietly, dismantling the stone altar and chopping down the wooden symbol of false worship. In their place, Gideon built an altar to the Lord and offered a bull as a sacrifice, using the wood from the Asherah pole as fuel for the fire. When morning came, the men of the town discovered what had been done. Their rage was immediate and fierce. They demanded that Joash, Gideon's father, bring out his son to be killed for destroying the altar of Baal, but Joash surprised everyone, including his son, with his response. "Are you going to plead Baal's cause?" he asked the angry crowd. "If Baal really is a god, he can defend himself when someone breaks down his altar." From that day on, Gideon was called Jerub-Baal, meaning "let Baal contend with him." But even after this first victory, even after seeing fire consume his sacrifice and hearing the voice of the Lord, doubt still gnawed at Gideon's heart like a persistent wound. When the Midianites assembled once again for their annual raid, gathering in the valley like a dark sea of destruction, Gideon knew the time had come. Yet still he hesitated. Still he needed more assurance. That night he took a wool fleece and placed it on the threshing floor. "If you will save Israel by my hand as you have promised," he prayed, "look, I will place a wool fleece on the threshing floor. If there is dew only on the fleece and all the ground is dry, then I will know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you said." In the morning the fleece was soaked with dew, while the ground around it was completely dry. Gideon wrung out the fleece and filled a bowl with water, but still he doubted. Still he feared he was deceiving himself. "Do not be angry with me," he prayed again. "Let me make just one more request. Allow me one more test with the fleece, but this time make the fleece dry and let the ground be covered with dew." And God, patient with his fearful servant, did exactly as Gideon asked. The next morning the fleece was dry while dew covered all the ground around it. Finally Gideon could doubt no longer. The signs were clear, the calling was certain. The God of Israel had indeed chosen him, the least and the weakest, to deliver his people from their oppressors. But as Gideon would soon discover, God's ways of winning battles were as unexpected as his choice of champions. Word spread quickly through the hill country of Israel. Gideon, son of Joash, had called for warriors to gather at the spring of Harod. The response was overwhelming. Men came from every tribe, every village, every cave where families had been hiding. They came carrying whatever weapons they could find. Old swords passed down from fathers, farming implements that could serve as spears, slings and stones gathered from riverbeds. 32,000 men answered the call. It was a significant force, larger than any army Israel had mustered in years. As Gideon looked out over the sea of faces, weathered by years of oppression, but now bright with hope, he felt a stirring of confidence. Perhaps this task wouldn't be as impossible as it had seemed. But even as he counted his forces, Gideon knew they were still vastly outnumbered. In the valley below, the Midianites and their allies spread across the landscape like a plague of locusts. Their camels were indeed as numerous as the sand on the seashore. Their warriors a dark tide that seemed to stretch to the horizon. Conservative estimates put their numbers at over 100,000 fighting men, but some said there were twice that many. Gideon was contemplating these daunting odds when the Lord spoke to him once again, and the words he heard made his blood run cold. "You have too many men," the Lord said. "I cannot deliver Midian into their hands, or Israel would boast against me. My own strength has saved me. Now announce to the army, anyone who trembles with fear may turn back and leave Mount Gilead." Too many men. Gideon stared out at his army, then down at the vast enemy host in the valley. How could 32,000 be too many when facing such overwhelming odds? But the Lord's reasoning became clear. If Israel won this battle with such numbers, they would attribute the victory to their own military might, rather than to God's power. With a heavy heart, Gideon stood before his assembled forces. These men had left their families, their hiding places, their small measures of safety to answer his call. Now he had to tell some of them to go home. "Men of Israel," he called out, his voice carrying across the gathered warriors. "The Lord has spoken to me. Anyone among you who is afraid, anyone who trembles with fear, may return to his home. There is no shame in this. Go in peace." A murmur rippled through the crowd. Some men looked relieved, others confused, still others ashamed. But slowly, surely, men began to step forward, to gather their belongings, to turn away from the camp. What started as a trickle became a stream, then a flood. By evening, 22,000 men had departed for their homes, leaving only 10,000 behind. Gideon watched them go with a mixture of understanding and dread. He couldn't blame them for their fear, not after 7 years of running and hiding, but now his army was less than a third of its original size, facing an enemy that seemed to grow larger with every passing hour. Surely now the Lord would be satisfied with the numbers. Surely now they could plan their attack, develop their strategy, prepare for battle. But as the sun set over the camp, painting the sky the colour of blood, the voice of the Lord came to Gideon once more. "There are still too many men," the Lord said. "Take them down to the water, and I will thin them out for you there." Gideon felt as if the ground was shifting beneath his feet. Still too many? 10,000 men were still too many to face 100,000? What kind of battle was the Lord planning? The next morning Gideon led his remaining men down to the spring of Harod. The water was clear and cold, bubbling up from underground sources that had never failed, even in the driest years. The men were thirsty from the march and eager to drink. Separate those who lapped the water with their tongues, as a dog laps from those who kneel down to drink, the Lord instructed. Gideon watched carefully as his men approached the water. Most of them, weary and relieved to finally rest, knelt down and put their faces directly to the stream, drinking deeply. But a few, perhaps more cautious or alert, cupped water in their hands and lapped it quickly while keeping their eyes up, watching for danger. When the test was complete, Gideon counted with growing amazement and terror. Only 300 men had lapped the water like dogs. 300 out of 10,000. 300 to face the multitudes of Midian. "With the 300 men that lapped I will save you and give the Midianites into your hands," the Lord said. "Let all the others return home." The dismissal of the remaining 9,700 men was even more painful than the first reduction. These were the men who had stayed when others fled, who had shown courage and commitment. Yet now they too had to be sent away, carrying with them the supplies and provisions that would have sustained a larger force. As evening fell over the camp, Gideon found himself staring at his tiny army. 300 men sat around small fires, their faces illuminated by flickering flames. Some sharpened weapons, others mended gear, still others simply stared into the darkness where their enemies waited. They were farmers and shepherds, craftsmen and traders. None of them were professional soldiers. None of them had trained for this kind of warfare. Gideon walked among them, listening to their quiet conversations. Some spoke of their families, wondering if they would ever see their wives and children again. Others talked about the enemy, speculating about Midianite tactics and weapons. A few prayed quietly, their voices barely audible above the crackling of the fires. "Do you think we can win?" one young man asked his companion, his voice carrying the weight of doubt that Gideon felt in his own heart. "With God's help," came the reply, but even that voice held uncertainty. As Gideon continued his circuit of the camp, he felt the familiar weight of fear settling on his shoulders like a heavy cloak. 300 men. It was impossible. It was madness. It was a recipe for massacre, not victory. But even as doubt assailed him, Gideon remembered the fire that had consumed his sacrifice, the signs with the fleece, the voice that had called him mighty warrior when he was anything but mighty. The God who had chosen him, who had reduced his army to an impossibly small number, was the same God who had parted the Red Sea, who had brought down the walls of Jericho with trumpets and shouts. Still, as he looked out toward the valley, where enemy campfires twinkled like stars fallen to earth, Gideon found himself struggling with the same fears that had driven him to test God with fleeces. The odds were beyond daunting. They were simply impossible. But perhaps, he thought with growing understanding, that was exactly the point. Sleep eluded Gideon that night. He tossed on his simple bedroll, listening to the sounds of his small army around him. Some of the men snored peacefully, displaying a faith or fatalism that he envied. Others, like himself, shifted restlessly, no doubt contemplating the impossibility of what lay ahead. As the night deepened, the Lord spoke to him once more. "Get up, go down against the camp, because I am going to give it into your hands. If you are afraid to attack, go down to the camp with your servant Purah and listen to what they are saying. Afterward, he will be encouraged to attack the camp." The Lord knew him well, Gideon realised. He was indeed afraid, terrified beyond measure. The offer to scout the enemy camp was exactly what his anxious heart needed. Taking his servant Purah, a young man who had served his family faithfully for years, Gideon crept away from the Israeli camp under cover of darkness. The descent into the valley was treacherous in the darkness. They picked their way carefully between rocks and thorny bushes, each step taking them closer to the vast enemy encampment. As they drew near, the sheer scale of the Midianite army became even more overwhelming. Their campfires stretched as far as the eye could see in every direction, creating a galaxy of light in the darkness of the valley floor. The smell hit them first, thousands of camels, horses and men, creating a pungent mixture that hung heavy in the still night air. Then came the sounds, snoring, quiet conversations, the shuffling of animals, the occasional clank of weapons or armour. It was like approaching a vast, slumbering beast that could wake at any moment and devour them. Gideon and Purah crept to the edge of the camp, staying low among the rocks and scrub brush that dotted the valley floor. The nearest tents were only a few dozen yards away, their dark silhouettes outlined against the glow of dying fires. Guards moved slowly through the camp, but their attention was focused inward, watching for disturbances among their own people rather than looking outward for threats. As they settled into their hiding place, Gideon heard voices from a nearby tent. Two men were talking in low tones, their conversation carrying clearly in the still night air. "I had the most disturbing dream," one man was saying. "I dreamed that a round loaf of barley bread came tumbling into the Midianite camp. It struck the tent with such force that the tent overturned and collapsed." His companion was quiet for a moment before responding, and when he did, his voice was heavy with foreboding. "This can be nothing other than the sword of Gideon, son of Joash, the Israelite. God has given the Midianites and the whole camp into his hands." Gideon felt as if lightning had struck him. Here in the heart of the enemy camp, these soldiers were talking about him, about his victory, about their own defeat. The dream was clearly a sign from God. A simple barley loaf representing humble Israel would overturn the mighty tent of Midian. He grasped Purah's arm, and together they crept back through the darkness toward their own camp. But now the impossible seemed possible. Now the 300 seemed not like a pitifully small force, but like the perfect instrument of God's power. The enemy was already defeated in their hearts. All that remained was to make that defeat a reality. Back in the camp, Gideon woke his sleeping warriors. "Get up," he whispered urgently. "The Lord has given the Midianite camp into your hands." The men rose quickly, gathering around their commander in the darkness. Gideon's voice was transformed, no longer tentative and fearful, but filled with supernatural confidence. "Listen carefully," he said. "We will divide into 3 companies of 100 men each. I will give each of you a trumpet and an empty jar with a torch inside it. Watch me and do exactly what I do. When I and all who are with me blow our trumpets, then you blow your trumpets all around the camp and shout, 'For the Lord and for Gideon.'" The plan was unlike anything any of them had ever heard of. No swords, no spears, no conventional weapons at all. Just trumpets, empty pottery jars and torches. It seemed almost like madness, but there was something in Gideon's voice, something in his bearing, that convinced them this was indeed the Lord's strategy. The men moved quickly and quietly to gather the supplies they would need. Clay jars were found and emptied. Torches were prepared and placed carefully inside, so that their light was completely hidden. Each man took a trumpet, though few of them had any experience with such instruments. The plan didn't require musical skill, however, only the ability to make noise. As the first company prepared to move out, Gideon looked at his men one final time. These farmers and shepherds, these ordinary men who had answered an extraordinary call, were about to attempt something that would be remembered for generations to come. They were terrified. He could see it in their faces, but they were also determined. They had come too far to turn back now. "Remember," Gideon said quietly, "we are not fighting this battle alone. The Lord goes before us. Trust in him, follow my lead, and we will see the salvation of Israel this very night." The three companies spread out in the darkness, moving carefully around the perimeter of the enormous enemy camp. It took time to get into position, with each group having to navigate difficult terrain while carrying their unusual equipment. But finally, just as the middle watch began, just as the guards were changing and the camp was at its most vulnerable, Gideon's company reached their position on one side of the valley. He looked across the vast sea of tents and fires, knowing that his other two companies were in position on the other sides. Somewhere out there in the darkness, 200 other men were waiting for his signal, trusting him to lead them in this impossible venture. Gideon raised his trumpet to his lips, lifted his jar with its hidden torch, and prepared to find out whether the God of Israel would indeed fight for his people. The moment had come. 300 men were about to challenge an army of over 100,000, armed with nothing but faith and the most unusual weapons in the history of warfare. The fate of Israel hung in the balance, suspended in the darkness between doubt and faith, between human impossibility and divine power. The signal came like thunder splitting the night sky. Gideon's trumpet blast echoed off the hills surrounding the valley, a piercing note that seemed to come from heaven itself. In the same instant, he smashed his clay jar against a rock, releasing the torch inside to blaze forth like a star suddenly born in the darkness. "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon," he shouted at the top of his lungs. The response was immediate and devastating. All around the perimeter of the vast Midianite camp, 299 other men followed their commander's example. The sound was indescribable. 300 trumpets blowing at once, creating a wall of noise that seemed to shake the very foundations of the earth. 300 clay jars smashed simultaneously, the sound like thunder crashing over and over again. 300 torches suddenly blazed to life, creating a ring of fire around the sleeping army. And 300 voices roared out the battle cry, "A sword for the Lord and for Gideon." The effect on the Midianite camp was catastrophic. Men who had been sleeping peacefully moments before were jolted awake by the tremendous noise, their minds struggling to comprehend what was happening. In the darkness, disoriented and terrified, they saw only the ring of torches surrounding them, and heard only the overwhelming sound of trumpets and shouting. To their sleep-clouded minds, it seemed as if they were surrounded by a vast army. The torches suggested thousands of soldiers, each one marking a warrior ready to attack. The trumpet spoke of organised military might, of disciplined forces moving in coordinated assault. The unified battle cry indicated an enemy confident of victory, sure of their superior strength. Panic spread through the camp like wildfire. Men stumbled from their tents, grabbing weapons, looking desperately for officers to tell them what to do. But in the chaos and darkness, with the deafening noise continuing all around them, communication was impossible. No one could hear orders over the sound of 300 trumpets. No one could see clearly through the confusion of flickering torches and deep shadows. "We're surrounded," someone screamed. "The whole Israeli army is here," shouted another. "We're all going to die," cried a third. The panic was contagious, spreading from tent to tent, from company to company, until the entire vast army was in the grip of terror. Men began running in all directions, some trying to escape what they perceived as encirclement, others attempting to mount some kind of defence against an enemy they couldn't see or understand. In their confusion and fear, the unthinkable began to happen. Midianite soldiers, unable to distinguish friend from foe in the chaos, began attacking each other. A man running through the darkness looked like an enemy soldier. A voice shouting commands in the confusion sounded like the voice of an Israeli warrior. Every shadow could be hiding an attacker. Swords were drawn not against the 300 Israelites on the perimeter, but against fellow Midianites. Spears were thrust not at the enemy, but at allies who had become indistinguishable from foes in the panic and darkness. The great army that had terrorized Israel for 7 years was turning on itself, destroying itself in its fear and confusion. Gideon and his men maintained their positions around the camp, continuing to blow their trumpets and brandish their torches, watching in amazement as their enemies did the work of destruction for them. It was the most extraordinary battle any of them had ever witnessed, a battle won without striking a single blow, a victory achieved through terror rather than traditional warfare. As the chaos in the camp intensified, the Midianites began a massive retreat. Those who could find their camels or horses fled toward the Jordan River and beyond. Others ran on foot, abandoning their weapons, their supplies, their wounded comrades, in their desperate attempt to escape what they believed was certain annihilation. But Gideon was not content to simply watch his enemies flee. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the eastern hills, he sent messengers throughout the hill country of Israel, calling on his countrymen to join the pursuit. "Come down against the Midianites," the messengers proclaimed, "and seize the waters of the Jordan ahead of them as far as Beth-barah." The response was immediate and enthusiastic. Men who had been hiding in caves for 7 years suddenly found themselves called to active pursuit of their oppressors. They came streaming down from the hills, like water released from a dam, energized by the news that the mighty Midianite army was in full retreat. The men of Ephraim were particularly effective, seizing the fords of the Jordan River and trapping many of the fleeing enemy forces. They captured and killed Oreb and Zeb, 2 of the Midianite leaders, bringing their heads to Gideon as proof of their victory. Meanwhile, Gideon and his original 300 men continued the pursuit of the main enemy force. They crossed the Jordan River, following the fleeing armies eastward into the desert. Despite their exhaustion, despite having had no sleep and little food, they pressed on relentlessly. The psychological impact of the night's events had completely broken the spirit of the Midianite alliance. Armies that had seemed invincible just hours before were now scattered bands of demoralized fugitives. The camels that had been as numerous as sand by the seashore were now obstacles to rapid flight rather than instruments of swift attack. Gideon's small force continued to grow as more Israelites joined the pursuit. Men from Naphtali, Asher, and all of Manasseh took up arms and chased the fleeing enemy. What had begun as an impossible battle for 300 men had become a nationwide uprising, a complete reversal of 7 years of oppression. The fleeing Midianites tried to regroup at Succoth and Penuel, but the local officials, perhaps fearing retaliation, refused to provide them with food or assistance. Gideon's pursuit was relentless, driving them ever deeper into the wilderness, further from their base of operations, further from any hope of mounting a counterattack. Finally, in the desert east of the Jordan, Gideon caught up with the remnants of the great army. Zebah and Zalmunna, the 2 kings of Midian, were there with about 15,000 men, all that was left of an army that had once numbered over 100,000. Even this reduced force vastly outnumbered Gideon's 300, but their spirit was completely broken. The final battle was swift and decisive. The Midianite army, already demoralized and exhausted, offered little resistance. Zebah and Zalmunna were captured alive, bringing to an end the 7-year reign of terror that had plagued Israel. As the sun set on that remarkable day, Gideon found himself looking out over a battlefield strewn with the evidence of complete victory. The mighty army that had seemed invincible just 24 hours earlier was destroyed. The kings who had terrorized his people were prisoners. The oppression that had driven Israel into caves and hiding places was broken forever. It had all begun with 300 men, 300 trumpets, 300 torches, and faith in a God who specializes in impossible victories. The journey back to Israel was unlike anything the land had seen in generations. What had begun as a desperate flight by 300 terrified farmers had become a triumphant procession that seemed to grow with every mile. Men emerged from caves and hidden places, women came out of their refuges, children ran alongside the returning heroes. The roads that had been empty for 7 years, too dangerous for normal travel, were now filled with celebration. Gideon rode at the head of the procession, the captured kings Zeba and Zalmunna walking in chains behind him. The sight of these once mighty rulers, who had struck terror into Israelite hearts for so long, now humbled and defeated, was almost too wonderful to believe. People lined the roads just to see them, to confirm with their own eyes that the nightmare was truly over. As they passed through villages and towns that had been ghost settlements just days before, people poured out of their houses with tears of joy streaming down their faces. Children, who had never known anything but hiding and fear, looked with wonder at the defeated enemy kings. Elderly men and women who remembered the time before the oppression began whispered prayers of thanksgiving to the God who had delivered them. The celebration that erupted across Israel was spontaneous and overwhelming. In every settlement, people brought out whatever food they had hidden away and shared it freely. Wine that had been buried for safekeeping was uncorked and passed around. Songs that had been silenced for 7 years rang out again from hilltops and valleys. But perhaps the most remarkable aspect of the victory was how complete it had been. The Midianite power was not just temporarily broken, but utterly destroyed. Their military organisation was shattered, their leadership eliminated, their will to fight completely crushed. Never again would they be able to mount the kind of massive raids that had devastated Israel year after year. The psychological impact was equally profound. For 7 years, the Israelites had seen themselves as victims, as weak and helpless prey for stronger predators. Now they had witnessed their God fighting for them in the most dramatic way imaginable. The story of the 300 and their trumpets would be told and retold around campfires for generations to come. A permanent reminder that no enemy is too strong when the Lord chooses to fight for his people. When Gideon finally reached his homeland, representatives from all the tribes of Israel came to meet him. They came with a proposal that on the surface seemed like the natural conclusion to his remarkable victory. "Rule over us," they said, their voices filled with genuine admiration and gratitude. "You, your son, and your grandson, because you have saved us from the hand of Midian." It was an offer of kingship, of dynastic rule that would establish Gideon's family as the permanent rulers of Israel. After centuries of loose tribal confederation, of judges who arose in times of crisis only to fade from prominence when the emergency passed, the people were ready for something more permanent, more stable, and who better to serve as their king than the man who had delivered them from their greatest enemy? The offer was tempting beyond measure. Gideon had gone from threshing wheat in secret to being offered the crown of all Israel. The boy who had hidden in wine presses was being invited to sit on a throne. The man who had doubted his own worth was being told that he was worthy to found a royal dynasty. But Gideon's response revealed the depth of his spiritual growth during this incredible journey. The fearful farmer who had needed multiple signs and confirmations, had become a man who understood something fundamental about the nature of God's kingdom. "I will not rule over you," he declared firmly, "nor will my son rule over you. The Lord will rule over you." It was a profound statement of faith and wisdom. Gideon recognized that Israel's true king was the Lord himself, and that any human ruler would be merely a steward of God's authority. He had learned through his own experience that victory came not through human strength or wisdom, but through complete dependence on divine power. To accept a crown now would be to claim credit for what God alone had accomplished. The people were disappointed but not surprised. They had seen enough of Gideon's character to understand that he was not motivated by personal ambition. Still, they wanted to honour him in some way, to create some lasting memorial to his remarkable victory. Gideon did make one request of the people, though it would prove to be a fateful one. "I do ask one thing of you," he said. "Each of you give me an earring from your share of the plunder." The Midianites, like many desert peoples, wore gold earrings, and the spoils of victory included a considerable amount of such jewellery. The Israelites were happy to comply with this modest request. They spread out a garment, and each man threw a gold earring onto it. When all the contributions were gathered, the weight of the gold was 1,700 shekels, an enormous fortune by the standards of the time. In addition to the earrings, there were ornaments, pendants, and purple garments worn by the Midianite kings, as well as chains from their camels' necks. With this gold, Gideon made an ephod, a ceremonial garment similar to what the high priest wore. His intentions may have been pure, perhaps wanting to create a memorial to God's victory, or a way for the people to seek divine guidance. But the results were tragic. All Israel prostituted themselves by worshipping it there, and it became a snare to Gideon and his family. The very man who had torn down his father's altar to Baal, who had refused the crown because only God should rule Israel, inadvertently created an object that led his people back into idolatry. It was a sobering reminder of how easy it is for even the most faithful to stumble, how quickly victory can turn to spiritual defeat. The golden ephod, created from the spoils of a battle won by faith alone, became a false god that drew the people's hearts away from the true God who had delivered them. Yet despite this failing, the primary result of Gideon's victory endured. The land had peace for 40 years during his lifetime. The Midianites never recovered from their devastating defeat. Other potential enemies, seeing what had happened to the mighty Desert Confederation, thought twice before threatening Israel. Gideon himself lived quietly on his estate, enjoying the respect of his people, but never again taking up the sword. He married and had many children, 70 sons from his various wives. One son, born to a concubine in Shechem, was named Abimelech, and he would later bring great trouble to Israel in his quest for the power his father had refused. When Gideon died at a good old age, he was buried in the tomb of his father Joash in Ophrah of the Abiezrites. His death marked the end of an era, the passing of a man who had embodied both the highest faith and the deepest human frailty. As we reach the end of this ancient story, told now across thousands of years and countless retellings, the lessons of Gideon's life continue to resonate with profound relevance. His journey, from fearful farmer to victorious leader, speaks to truths that transcend time and culture, offering wisdom for anyone who has ever felt inadequate for the tasks before them. The first and most striking lesson is how God chooses his instruments. When the angel called Gideon a mighty warrior while he hid in a wine press, it seemed like either a mistake or a cruel joke. Gideon was none of the things we typically associate with great leaders. He wasn't brave, wasn't confident, wasn't from an important family, wasn't trained in warfare or politics. By every human measure, he was spectacularly unqualified for the task ahead. Yet this was precisely why God chose him. The Lord deliberately selects the weak to confound the strong, the foolish to shame the wise, the lowly to humble the proud. Gideon's weakness became the perfect vessel for divine strength because there could be no question about who deserved the credit for the victory. This principle was reinforced by the reduction of Gideon's army from 32,000 to 300. With overwhelming numbers, Israel might have attributed their victory to superior military strategy or exceptional courage. With just 300 men, there could be no doubt that the victory belonged to God alone. The method of the victory itself drove this point home with unmistakable clarity. No swords were swung, no arrows were shot, no conventional battle was fought. Instead, the enemy was defeated by trumpets, torches, and shouting. It was a victory that made no sense according to human wisdom, but perfect sense according to divine strategy. Gideon's story also illustrates the patient grace of God toward human weakness. When Gideon asked for signs, when he tested God with fleeces, when he needed encouragement through overhearing the enemy's dream, the Lord did not respond with anger or impatience. Instead, he provided exactly what his frightened servant needed to move forward in faith. This divine patience extends to our failures as well as our fears. Even when Gideon created the golden ephod that led Israel into idolatry, even when his victory was tainted by this spiritual stumble, God's larger purposes were not thwarted. The peace that came to Israel lasted for 40 years, and the story of Gideon's faith continued to inspire future generations. Yet Gideon's failure with the ephod serves as a sobering warning about the subtle nature of spiritual pride. The man who had refused a crown could still fall into the trap of creating an object that drew worship away from God. Victory can be more spiritually dangerous than defeat, success more corrupting than failure. Even those who have experienced God's power in extraordinary ways must remain vigilant against the pride that can grow from their very victories. The story also reveals the importance of recognizing God's sovereignty in our circumstances. When Gideon questioned why God had allowed the Midianite oppression, he was struggling with one of humanity's oldest questions: why does a good God permit suffering? The answer that emerges from his story is not a theological explanation, but a practical demonstration. God had not abandoned his people. He was preparing to deliver them in a way that would reveal his power and restore their faith. Sometimes what looks like divine absence is actually divine preparation. The 7 years of oppression created the conditions that made Israel ready to trust completely in God rather than in their own strength. Without that desperation, they might never have been willing to follow 300 men with trumpets against an army of over 100,000. Gideon's reluctance to accept the crown offers another crucial lesson about the nature of true leadership. The people wanted to make him king because he had saved them, but Gideon understood that salvation belongs to God alone. Human leaders are at their best when they serve as instruments of divine will rather than as objects of human worship. This principle applies far beyond political leadership. In families, in businesses, in communities, in churches, the most effective leaders are those who understand that their authority is delegated, that their successes come from sources beyond themselves, that their role is to point others toward truth rather than toward their own personalities or achievements. The transformation in Gideon's character throughout the story demonstrates the power of stepping out in faith despite fear. The man who ended the story was dramatically different from the one who began it, not because his circumstances had changed, but because he had learned to trust in something greater than his circumstances. He discovered what countless others have learned: that God's strength is made perfect in human weakness, that his power is most clearly displayed when human power is obviously inadequate, that the greatest victories often come in ways that make no earthly sense. For modern listeners, Gideon's story speaks to anyone who has ever felt overwhelmed by the challenges they face. Whether dealing with personal struggles, family crises, professional obstacles, or community problems, the principles that guided Gideon remain relevant. True solutions often come not through human wisdom or strength, but through surrender to divine wisdom and dependence on divine strength. The story encourages us to look beyond the odds, beyond our qualifications, beyond conventional approaches, to find the unexpected ways that God might work. It reminds us that He specialises in impossible situations, that He delights in using unlikely people, that He often works in ways that confound human expectations. At the same time, Gideon's story warns us about the ongoing nature of spiritual vigilance. Victory is not a destination, but a stepping stone. Success is not an end, but a beginning. Even those who have experienced God's power in remarkable ways must continue to guard their hearts against pride, idolatry, and spiritual complacency. The golden ephod that became a snare to Gideon serves as a perpetual reminder that our greatest spiritual dangers often arise not from our failures, but from our successes, not from our weaknesses, but from our strengths, not from what we lack, but from what we have achieved. As we close this ancient tale, we're reminded that Gideon's story is ultimately not about Gideon at all. It's about a God who sees potential where others see only weakness, who creates strength from surrender, who wins victories through the most unlikely means. It's about divine love that persists through human doubt, divine patience that endures human testing, divine power that works through human frailty. The trumpets that shattered the midnight silence in that valley so long ago continue to echo through the centuries, calling each generation to trust in something greater than themselves, to step forward in faith despite their fears, to discover that the God who delivered Israel through 300 men with torches is still in the business of impossible victories. In our own valleys of challenge and oppression, surrounded by enemies that seem too numerous to count, facing odds that appear insurmountable, Gideon's story whispers the same truth that changed a fearful farmer into a mighty warrior. The Lord is with you, and in Him even the weakest can become strong. Even the smallest can achieve great things. Even the most unlikely can be used for extraordinary purposes. The battle belongs to the Lord, and in Him, victory is always possible. And so we end where we began, with a simple truth that transcends time and circumstance. When God chooses to fight for His people, no enemy can stand, no odds are too great, and no victory is impossible. The story of Gideon continues to unfold in every generation, in every heart that learns to trust, not in human strength, but in divine power, not in earthly wisdom, but in heavenly guidance, not in what we can see, but in what God can do. May this ancient story find new life in modern hearts. May its lessons take root in contemporary soil, and may its timeless truths continue to inspire faith, courage, and hope in all who hear it. For the God who called Gideon from his hiding place continues to call ordinary people to extraordinary purposes, continues to choose the weak to confound the strong, and continues to win impossible victories through the most unlikely means. The story of Gideon is, in the end, the story of all who learn to trust in something greater than themselves. It is the story of divine love that never gives up, divine power that never fails, and divine grace that transforms fearful hiding into mighty victory. This has been the story of Gideon and the battle against Midian, shared with you tonight through sacred slumber. May it bring you peace, may it strengthen your faith, and may it remind you that no challenge is too great when faced with divine help. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be filled with the trumpets of victory and the light of hope that never dies.